Section 36 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. The Ladies' Geography. Description of the island of Ceylon, continued from page 480. This country, though mountainous, is watered by a great number of very fine rivers which fall from the mountains. Most of them are too full of rocks to be navigable, but they contain fish in great abundance. The river of Mavelagongu, which is the principal of them, has its source in the Picus Adami, of which we shall give a description hereafter. It traverses the whole island towards the north and falls into the sea at Trinquemale. Its breadth is about a crossbow shot. The rocks, which render it very little navigable, afford harbor and retreat to a great number of alligators. It runs within a quarter of a league of the town of Kandy, but as the rapidity of its waters will not admit of any bridge being built over it, it can only be crossed in little canoes. It is moreover a point of policy amongst the inhabitants, who are far from desirous to render traveling commodious in their country, but rather choose to embarrass the roads as much as possible. In some places this river flows for leagues together without meeting any interruption from the rocks. But the Ceylonese in general reap very little advantages from the waters, either in the way of commerce or for the conveyance of goods. Excepting the province of Uva and the districts of Udipalat and Dolasbang, the whole island is covered with wood. It is well peopled about the center, but very indifferently towards the borders. The inhabitants do indeed show many places where they pretend heretofore to have had very considerable cities, the names of which the places retain to this day, but there are scarcely the vestiges of any buildings remaining in them. Knox, who traversed the island several times, takes notice of only 5 which can deserve that title, and in which the king has palaces, although they are all in ruins, excepting that which he particularly inhabits. Of these cities, Kandy or Kondi is the chief. It has the advantage of being placed in the center of the island, so that it may be approached with equal facility from every part of it. Its form is triangular, and according to the custom of the country, the king's palace occupies the eastern angle of it. It is fortified only to the south, because the access to it is more open there than from any other quarter. This fortification, however, is nothing more than a rampart of earth, about 20 feet high, which crosses the valley from one mountain to another. All the avenues to the city, for 2 or 3 miles distance, are closed up with barriers of thorn, and a continual guard always kept at them, and the great river which comes down from the Picus Adami passes within a quarter of a league of it towards the south. The next city is Nelembi Naor, about 12 miles south of the preceding. Alu Naor stands to the northeast of Kandy, where the king keeps large magazines of corn and rice in reserve against the time of war. Badula, which is the 4th city, is 2 days' journey from Kandy, towards the east of the province of Uva. In this province, the best tobacco in the island is cultivated. It is very well watered, but wood is scarce. Rice and cattle, however, are in abundance in it, with respect to which, however, this very singular circumstance is observable, that the cattle reared there cannot live for any considerable time when transported into any other province, the occasion of which is attributed to a certain shrub which is found in all the other provinces and not in this. The 5th and last of these cities is Diglignir, situated also to the east of Kandy. In this city the king has kept his court ever since the year 1664, when a revolt of his subjects drove him to quit Kandy, and with his departure began the ruin of that city. It is situated in the province of Hwative, a country which is covered with mountains and rocks that render the soil of it extremely infertile. Yet has the king chosen it for his residence as a place of security by being in the neighborhood of a very high mountain called Gauluda, which may on any occasion afford him a safe retreat, and where as much rice may be gathered as will amply maintain the garrison of 3 forts, which defend the entrance to it. It is extremely steep on all sides, and so infested with rocks, woods, and precipices that a handful of men might stand their ground there against very numerous armies. As to the towns and villages of Ceylon, although they are very numerous, there are few of them that are worth a traveller's attention. The most remarkable are those which are consecrated to their idols, in which some of their devils or temples may be seen. The inhabitants give themselves very little trouble about making their streets straight or preserving any regularity in their houses, each family living in a separate building which is most usually surrounded with a hedge and ditch. The Ceylonese never build in the high road, as they do not choose to be observed by passengers. Their largest villages do not contain above 100 houses. Their usual number is about 40 or 50, although there are some which consist of only 8 or 10. Besides which, they quit them whenever sickness happens to be in any degree frequent amongst them, or that 2 or 3 people chance to die within any small space of time. They then imagine that the devil has taken possession of the place, and therefore immediately abandon their lands and habitations in order to go in search of some more fortunate dwelling. The king's palace at de Lignières is surrounded with a rampart of earth, cased with thatch to prevent the rains beating it down. This enclosure is full of various irregular buildings, most of them low and covered with stubble, excepting some few whose roofs are tiled. These latter have 2 stories with open galleries round them to let in air, surrounded with balusters, some of ebony and others of painted wood. The windows are also inlaid with plates of silver and ebony, and the top of each edifice adorned with vases of earth or moresque. These several buildings form a kind of labyrinth to which there are a great number of very handsome gates, 2 of which have drawbridges to them. The porticos of these are of a most admirable relief, and even to the very locks and bolts are decorated with carved work. At each of these doors and at every passage are placed sentinels, which are regularly relieved day and night. The common houses of the inhabitants are little, low, and thatched, nor are they allowed to build them with more than 1 story, nor to cover them with tiles, nor even to whiten the walls of them with lime, though they have a kind of white clay which they might employ with advantage to this use. As the country is very hot, they for the most part neglect the plastering of their walls, contenting themselves with the branches and leaves of trees. They have not even chimneys in their houses, but make what fire is necessary for the preparation of their victuals in a corner of their apartment, which blackens the floor very much. The grandees have houses very handsome and commodious, consisting for the most part of 2 buildings opposite to each other, and united by a wall which forms a square court. These walls are surrounded with borders of clay, rubbed over with cow dung, which renders them impenetrable by the rain. Their domestics and slaves inhabit the houses round them. As to the temperature of the air, it is very unwholesome in the southern parts, though all the rest of the country enjoys a very pure and healthy air. The valleys are, for the most part, marshy and full of fine springs. Those which have these qualities are looked on as the best, because the rice, which is the principal subsistence of the inhabitants, requires a great deal of moisture. The variety which is observed in the air and rains in the different parts of this island are very remarkable. When the west winds begin to blow, the western parts have great falls of rain, and this is the proper season to plough and till the ground. And yet, at the very same time, the eastern parts of the island enjoy very dry weather and gather in their harvest. On the contrary, when the wind blows from the east, they plough and till in the easterly parts, and gather in the corn in the opposite ones, towards the west. Thus the business of ploughing and harvest employs the islanders almost all the year round in different seasons of the year. The division of rain and drought is made about the middle of the island, and it frequently happens that there is rain on one side of the mountain of Karonghing, whilst it is extremely hot and dry on the other side of it. It is also remarked that this difference is no less violent than it is sudden, for on the quitting a very wet spot of ground, you shall come immediately into a soil, the heat of which shall scorch and burn your feet. The southern parts of the island, however, are not subject to this great quantity of wet weather, for there will sometimes continue there for 3 or 4 years together so great and constant a drought, that the ground shall be incapable of receiving any kind of culture. It is even difficult to dig any wells thereabouts deep enough to get water that can be drank, and even the very best that is to be got retains an acrimony and brackishness, which renders it extremely disagreeable. On the south of Kandy, and about 14 or 15 leagues from Colombo, is a mountain which is looked on as the highest in the island, and which, from its height and form, which is nearly that of a sugar loaf, is very distinctly to be seen not only all through the island, but even at upwards of 12 miles out at sea. This is the famous Picus Adami, whereof all the travellers who have ever been in this country have spoken with so much admiration. On a large flat stone, which is at the top of it, is an impression resembling that of a man's foot, but upwards of twice the natural size of one. The general superstition is that this mark was left there by the foot of our first parent, from whom therefore the mountain receives its name. In short, were we to recount all the fabulous things that the Ceylonese introduce in their history of this mountain, it would be only abusing the patience of our fair readers. Let it suffice then to give a plain description of the place, such as it is, only adding that these people look on it as a meritorious action to go and pay their adorations to this foot, especially on the first day of the year, which falls with them in the month of March, at which time are to be seen immense processions of men, women, and children who have undertaken this pilgrimage. Before you come then to the foot of the mountain, you meet with a very large and pleasant plain, watered with a great many rills which fall from the peak, and form at the bottom of it a pool to which the Gentiles frequently make a pilgrimage, never failing to bathe themselves in it, and wash their clothes and linen also therein, from a persuasion that the water has a virtue to efface all their sins. After this first act of superstition, they clamber to the top of the mountain, by assistance of iron chains affixed thereto, and without which it would be impossible to get up, so very steep is it, although there have been steps wrought out in many parts of it. The way to the top is at least 1/4 of a league. At a certain distance from the summit are erected 2 stone pillars surmounted by another stone which lies across them, and to which is suspended a large bell made of metal, having its clapper pierced with a hole big enough to pass an iron thong through it, which all the pilgrims are obliged to pull, and striking 1 stroke on the bell to try whether they are purified, because these idolaters imagine that if they are not so, the bell will give no sound. This imaginary misfortune, however, never happens to them. The summit of the mountain presents a plain surface of 150 paces in length, and 110 in breadth, in the middle of which is a flat stone, which it says bears the impression of a gigantic human foot, 2 palms long and 8 inches broad. There are some trees planted about this stone, and to the left of it are a few huts, whither the pilgrims retire. On the right hand there was formerly a very fine pagode, whereof the Solonese relate wonders, and Baldaeus describes 68 statues and figures which are to be met with in different cavities of the mountain. From the Picus Adami, as we have observed before, issue most of the rivers which water the island of Ceylon. Natural history of Ceylon. This island produces a great quantity of rice, in the cultivation of which the industry of the inhabitants renders itself extremely conspicuous, for when we come to consider how necessary water is in the culture of that grain, and at the same time recollect that great part of the island is extremely mountainous, it will appear wonderful that it should be so fertile as it is. The manner, however, that the Solonese have contrived for rendering it so, is by levelling the sides of these mountains at certain stages, from 3 to 8 feet in breadth, so as to form a kind of staircase from the bottom of the hill to the uppermost of these stages, in which they sow their rice. Now, as the island is very much visited with rain, and that there is besides a great frequency of springs on the mountains, they have found means to dig large reservoirs nearly on a level with the highest springs, from whence the water is made to fall in the uppermost rows, and from them gradually to the others, so as to keep them continually supplied with water. Some of these reservoirs are half a league in length, some less, and their depth usually from 2 to 3 yards. There are several kinds of rice distinguishable in the island of Ceylon, which are defined by different names, although they differ very little in their taste, and indeed scarcely in anything more than the length of time they take in ripening. Some is 7 months in coming to perfection, whilst some will ripen at 6, 5, 4, or 3 months' end. That which is soonest ripe is the best tasted, but does not yield so plentifully. There is even a kind which ripens in dry ground, and is therefore sowed in those places where it is not in the power of art to convey water. This would be a very great treasure to the inhabitants of the eastern parts, were it not much inferior to the other kinds both in taste and smell. Besides the rice, this island furnishes various sorts of grain, which, although by no means approaching to it in goodness, are nevertheless a very good resource in times of scarcity. They have also great quantities of excellent fruits, but they might reap much more advantage from them, if they were sufficiently fond of them to bestow some care on their cultivation. But as they pay very little regard to those which have nothing agreeable in them but their taste, and cannot serve them by way of food when the grain is at any time deficient, the only trees which they plant are those that produce nutritive fruits. The other kinds grow of themselves, and what still diminishes the care of the inhabitants is that in all places where nature produces any delicious fruits, the officers of the country tie a label round the tree in the king's name, with 3 knots at the end of it, which being done, no one dares touch it without running the hazard of a very severe punishment, and sometimes even of death. The fruit, when ripe, is generally carried in a white linen cloth to the governor of the province, who, selecting the finest, wraps it up in another linen cloth and sends it to court, keeping the rest for himself and returning none to the proprietors. End of section 36. Section 37 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. The Ladies' Museum, The Trifler, Number 10. Madam, in a life of 64 years, alas how times are altered. When I was young, what dread and reverence were paid to omens, dreams, visions, blue burning candles, knives and forks across each other, salt spilt by awkwardness, and every kind of prognostic that led into the avenues of fate. The present times, or rather the last 20 years of my existence, treat these important points as trifles. Owls screech unheard. I myself dream and repeat my dreams unregarded. Thieves appear in the watch-lights, and we lose a marrow spoon the next day. No matter, nothing foretold our loss. My elder sister, bedrid and very old, I confess, assures me that her curtains have been drawn aside 3 times within these 5 weeks by something in the shape of a dog without a head. But she, poor woman, is looked upon as doting. Jet, my little spaniel, I am sure, often sees something that comes from the other world, but Jet's a dog and can only bark at it. What a pity it is, madam, that we cannot at the same time, when we abhor the superstitions of popery, retain that veneration. I had almost said duty to celestial warnings, which, no longer ago than the Protestant reign of good Queen Anne, I can very well remember, had an influence over every action of our lives. It was then, madam, that a winding sheet in the candle, or a cinder coffin jumping out of the fire, sent many a wicked maid to her prayers and repentance for a whole week together. It was then, madam, that Dr. Aaron Sanford, the star-gazing haberdasher of Bednall Green, and Dr. Duncan Campbell, the deaf and dumb conjurer in Buckingham Court, were followed and revered with as true devotion as the Methodists are in these wicked days. Witches, indeed, have pretty well kept their ground, notwithstanding the thunder of an Act of Parliament and the execution of poor Thomas Colley, only for stifling Ruth Osborne, the witch of Tring, in a pond of water. It is not 6 months ago since I read an account in one of the newspapers of a witch in Northumberland. The best people in the parish assembled to take her. They surrounded her house boldly, and in a body they burst open the door, but they found she was flown, probably up the chimney and upon a broomstick. My mother and my grandmother have often informed me of many wonderful noises, apparitions, and visions that have been seen and heard in our family. My honored parents were not only pious matrons, but great believers, and shall I degenerate? All good stars forbid, yet I foresee that with me must die the usual family veneration for supernatural causes. My 2 granddaughters are incorrigibly obstinate and careless. They give each other knives and scissors, without considering the consequence that such kind of instruments invisibly cut love and affection. Sukey, the eldest, never fails to quit the room as soon as I begin to read my fate and coffee grounds, and her sister Nancy seems not to pay the least regard to Children's Day. What can I do? Pray, madam, assist me in correcting these 2 girls, and in teaching them to stand in awe of spirits, hobgoblins, fairies, death watches, and the will and the wisp. I am, madam, your most humble servant, Grace Pythoness. End of section 37. Section 38 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. The History of Harriot and Sophia continued. The first thought that struck the amazed Sophia was that Sir Charles, either following the motions of his natural inconstancy or in revenge of her supposed contempt of him, had married Harriot. Certainly that she had now lost forever this lover, who with all his real or imputed faults, she had never been able to banish from her heart. She resigned herself up to the sharpest agonies of despair, and had already arrived at her sister's house before she was able to stop the course of her tears. The servant in the livery of her own family opened the door. This circumstance surprised Sophia, who, pulling her hat over her eyes to conceal her disorder, asked him with some hesitation if his mistress was at home. The fellow replied he believed she was, and opening the coach door, showed her into a parlour, telling her with a smart air that he would inquire of his lady's woman whether she was visible yet or no. Sophia, having summoned all her fortitude to enable her to go through this severe trial with dignity, had time enough to recollect and compose herself before anyone appeared, and now several circumstances rushed upon her memory which in the first transports of her astonishment and grief had escaped her attention. Mrs. Darnley in her letter had not mentioned Harriet's marriage, but barely said she had left her. The servant who delivered her message called her Miss Darnley, and though she lived in a house that belonged to Sir Charles, yet it was scarcely suitable to the quality of his wife. A few moments' reflection upon these appearances made the generous Sophia change the object of her concern. The misfortune for which she had grieved so much seemed light compared with that she apprehended. She wept no longer for the inconstancy of her lover. She trembled for the honour of her sister, and her greatest fear now was that Sir Charles was not married. While she was absorbed in these melancholy thoughts, Harriet's maid entered the room, who, after glancing over Sophia with a supercilious eye, for she was very simply dressed, asked her if she had any business with her lady. "Tell her," replied Sophia, "that her sister is here." The girl blushed, curtsied, and flew to acquaint her mistress, and Sophia was instantly desired to walk upstairs. She found Harriet in her dressing-room in an elegant déshabillé, having just finished her morning's work, which appeared in a suit of ribbons made up with great taste. As soon as she saw Sophia, she rose from her chair and saluted her with affected dignity, but at the same time with an air of embarrassment that increased every moment, so that being unable to bear the sweet but penetrating looks of her sister, she resumed her work, altering and unripping without any apparent design, yet affecting to be extremely busy, and to show how perfectly she was at ease, talked of the most trifling matters imaginable, while Sophia gazed on her in silent anguish, anxious to know the truth of her situation, yet dreading to have it explained. At length she told her that she was going to Kensington to her mother, and desired to know if she had any message to send her. Harriet, suddenly interrupting her as if she feared some further questions, began to exclaim against her mother's unreasonable temper, saying that she had offended her violently only because she had it not in her power to comply with some very extravagant expectations which she had formed. "Sister," said Sophia, "I am wholly ignorant of your affairs. I know not what cause of discontent you have given my mother, but I see there is a great alteration in your condition of life, and I hope—" "What do you hope, pray, miss?" interrupted Harriet, reddening. "I suppose I am to have some of your satirical flings. Your temper is not altered, I find." "Dear Harriet," resumed Sophia, with tears in her eyes, this causeless anger confirming her suspicions, "why do you reproach me with being satirical? Is it a crime to be anxious for your happiness?" "I wish you would not trouble yourself about me," replied Harriet. "I know best what will make me happy. You should not pretend to instruct your elders, Miss Sophie. I am older than you. You know you have often upbraided me with that." "Sister," said Sophia calmly, "you desire to see me. Have you anything to say to me?" "I know," answered Harriet, "that I shall meet with ungrateful returns for my kindness. Nevertheless, I shall act like a sister towards you, and it was to tell you so that I wished to see you. I very much doubt whether, if you were in prosperity, you would do the same by me." "Have I behaved so ill in adversity, then," said Sophia, "that you form this harsh judgment of me, sister?" "Pray, don't upbraid me with your behavior, miss," said Harriet. "Other people may have behaved as well as you, though they are not prudes." "You say you are in prosperity, sister," said Sophia, "but perhaps you and I have different notions of prosperity. Let me know the truth of your situation, and if I find you happy according to my notions of happiness, you will soon be convinced that I can take a sister's share in it." "I am not obliged to give an account of my conduct to you," replied Harriet, who had listened to this speech with great emotion. "And I must tell you, Sister Sophie, that if you go on taking this liberty of questioning and censuring me, I shall not care how seldom I see you. As to my mother, I know that it is my duty to do everything for her that is in my power, and this I have offered to do already." Saying this, she rang the bell, and her maid appearing, she gave her some orders which necessarily required her attendance in the room, so that Sophia, finding she could have no further discourse with her sister, rose up and took leave of her with an aching heart. Her griefs, all aggravated by the apprehension of her sister's dishonour, and the hatred which she felt for Sir Charles, as her seducer, struggling with a tender remembrance, her gentle bosom was torn with conflicting passions, and she proved but too well the truth of that maxim, that philosophy easily triumphs over past and future evils, but the present triumph over her. Mrs. Darnley received her daughter with unusual tenderness. She felt how much she stood in need of her filial care, and her behavior was dictated by that interested kindness which only gives an expectation of receiving back doublefold. Sophia saw her pale and emaciated, and was greatly affected with the sight. She would not mention her sister for fear of discomposing her, but Mrs. Darnley soon introduced the subject that was most in her thoughts, and exclaimed against Harriet's undutifulness and want of affection with the most violent transports of passion. I have been the best of mothers to her, said she, melting into tears. I have always indulged her in all her wishes, and impaired my circumstances to support her extravagancies. And how has she returned this kindness? Would you think it, my dear Sophie, though she is in affluent circumstances, and I, by the loss of my annuity, am plunged into all my former distresses, she has refused to pay those debts which I contracted during the time she lived with me, and thinks it sufficient to invite me to reside in her house, where, no doubt, I should feel my dependence severely. Sir Charles, said Sophia, sighing, does not act with his usual generosity. If he has married my sister, why does he suffer you to be in distress? Married your sister? Repeated Mrs. Darnley, in astonishment. Ah, madam, resumed Sophia, is she not married then to Sir Charles? Why, is it possible that you can wish him to be married to Harriot? Said Mrs. Darnley. Alas, cried Sophia, ought I not wish it when I see her in his house? Oh, resumed Mrs. Darnley, I perceive your mistake. But that house is not Sir Charles's now. Lord L. bought it of him with the furniture some time ago. It might have been yours, and without any offence to your virtue, too, yet you thought fit to refuse it. But I will not pretend to reprove one so much wiser than myself. Well, madam, interrupted Sophia eagerly, then it is not to Sir Charles that my sister is married. To whom is she married? You have seen her, have you not? Said Mrs. Darnley, looking a little confused. I have indeed seen her, said Sophia, but she did not explain her situation to me. And do you imagine, resumed Mrs. Darnley peevishly, that she would be less reserved with her mother? And if she was afraid of telling you the truth, is it likely she would own it to me? Then I fear it is bad indeed with Harriot, cried Sophia in a melancholy accent, since she has so much to conceal from a mother and a sister. You are always censorious, Sophie, said Mrs. Darnley, with some passion. For my part, I am resolved to think the best. If Lord L. is married privately to your sister, her character will one day be cleared to the world, and she thinks no prudent person can blame her for choosing to bear for a time a few undeserved censures, rather than to struggle with poverty and contempt. Sophia, now convinced of Harriet's unhappy conduct, burst into tears. Mrs. Darnley, after looking at her in silence a moment, said with some confusion, Then you do not believe your sister is married, Sophie? Ah, madam, replied Sophia, you do not say that you know she is, and whatever reasons there might be for concealing her marriage from the world, certainly there are none for hiding it from you. In vain, added she, with still greater emotion, would your parental tenderness seek to deceive yourself? Reproach me no more with my tenderness for your sister, interrupted Mrs. Darnley angrily. I am too much afflicted with her ingratitude already. I am sorry she's ungrateful, said Sophia, but oh, my dear mamma, it is not fit you should accept of her assistance. I hope, said Mrs. Darnley, calling down her eyes, that I know what is fit for me to do as well as my daughter. But, Sophie, added she after a little pause, I am sorry to tell you, if you do not know it already, that if you still have any thoughts of Sir Charles, you deceive yourself. I am very well informed that a match has been proposed to him, and he has given so favourable an answer that it is expected the marriage will be concluded as soon as he comes from Paris. I heard it all from one of the young lady's relations. This was a severe stroke to poor Sophia, who had just begun to breathe again, after the anguish she had suffered and the belief that Sir Charles had forsaken her for her sister, and added perfidy and baseness to his inconstancy. Mrs. Darnley, who saw her turn pale and her eyes swimming in tears while she struggled to conceal her emotions, could not help being affected with her distress and endeavoured to console her. Sophia, more softened by this tenderness, suffered her tears to flow a few moments unrestrained, then suddenly wiping her charming eyes, Pardon this weakness, madam, said she. This indeed is not a time to weep for myself. Your sorrows claim all my tears. I have sorrows enough, heaven knows, said Mrs. Darnley. My debts unpaid, my annuity gone, what have I to trust to? Providence, interrupted Sophia, your piety and my industry. Alas, my dear mamma, your greatest affliction is not the loss of your annuity or the debts with which you are encumbered. It is my sister's unhappy fall from virtue. That parent, pursued she, who sees a beloved child become a prey to licentious passions, who sees her publicly incur shame and reproach, expel the society of the good and virtuous, and lead a life of dishonour, embittered with the contempt of the world, and the secret upbraidings of her own conscience, that parent can best judge of your anguish now. I have only a sister's feelings for this misfortune, but these feelings are strong enough to make me very unhappy. Mrs. Darnley appeared so much moved with this discourse that Sophia pursued it till she brought her mother to declare that she would rather suffer all the inconveniences of poverty than give a sanction to Harriot's guilt by partaking of its reward. Sophia, to relieve her anxiety, laid down a plan for their future subsistence, and proved to her that by her skill in several little useful arts, it would be easy for her to supply her with all the necessaries of life. "We will first," said she, "pay your debts." "How is that to be done?" said Mrs. Darnley, hastily. "The furniture of your house," said Sophia, "the plate and other pieces of finery which Sir Charles Stanley presented to you will, if converted into money, not only pay your debts, but provide a little fund for present expenses, and a reserve for future exigencies. Meanwhile, my industry and care will, I hope, keep want far from you. I have friends who will find employment for my little talents, and if I can but make your life easy and comfortable, I shall think myself happy." Mrs. Darnley, with tears in her eyes, embraced her daughter, bid her dispose of everything as she pleased, and assured her she would endeavour to bear her new condition of life with patience and resignation. Sophia immediately wrote to a gentleman of the law who had been an intimate friend of her father's, and he undertook to manage their little affairs in town. A few days afterwards, he brought them £50, which was all that remained from the sale, after every demand upon Mrs. Darnley was paid. She read over the accounts with great emotion, bitterly regretting every trinket she had parted with, and told Sophia that it was absolutely necessary they should settle in some village near town, for she could not bear the thoughts of exposing her poverty to her acquaintance, and of being seen in a worse condition than formerly. Sophia, who thought her declining health a better reason for not residing in London, hired in an adjacent village at a very small rent a little house, or rather cottage, so neat and situated so happily that an imagination lively as hers was, and a little romantic, could not fail of being charmed with it. To this place she removed her books, and being provided by her friend Dolly with an innocent country girl for a servant, she conducted her mother to her rural abode, and had the satisfaction to find her pleased with it, novelty having always charms for her, and here, for a few days, it supplied the place of those other gratifications to which she had been accustomed. In the midst of these cares, Sophia did not forget her unhappy sister. She wrote several letters to her, in which she employed all the power of virtuous eloquence to bring her to a sense of her errors, but in vain. Harriot did not deign to answer her, but in a letter to her mother she complained of the injurious treatment she received from Sophia, and earnestly entreated her to leave her sister and reside with her. Although Mrs. Darnley refused this offer with seeming steadiness, yet her discontent was but too apparent. A life of retirement, which often obliged her to seek in herself those resources against languor and melancholy which she used to find in the dissipations of the town, could not be grateful to one who had never accustomed herself to reflection, whose mind was filled with trifles, and its whole stock of ideas derived from dress, cards, and every other fashionable folly. To be capable of enjoying a rural life, there is something more necessary than a good understanding. Innocence and purity of manners must contribute to give a relish to pleasures which are founded in reason, virtue, and piety. Hence it was that Sophia, in the bloom of youth, found happiness in the solitude of a village, while her mother, in a declining age, panted after the vanities of the town. In vain did Mr. Herbert fill the letters he wrote to Mrs. Darnley with maxims of morality and pious admonitions. He experienced here the truth of that observation, that it is a work of great difficulty to dispossess vice from a heart, where long possession seems to plead prescription. Sophia, who knew her mother's taste for living at ease, that she might be able to gratify it, applied herself diligently to her work, which was a piece of embroidery that had been bespoke by a benevolent lady, in order to give her present employment, and, by exhibiting it as a proof of her ingenuity, to procure her more. She likewise exercised her invention in drawing little designs for fan mounts, and always chose such subjects as conveyed some moral lesson to the mind, while they pleased the imagination. Some of these drawings were disposed of by the lady her friend so advantageously that Sophia was encouraged to pursue her labor, and Mrs. Darnley, flattered by the prospect of more easy circumstances, began to enlarge her scheme of expense, made little excursions about the country in a post-chaise, talked of hiring a better house, and of passing 2 months at least in London during the winter. Meantime, Harriot became more earnest in her solicitations to her mother to come and live with her. Her situation began to be so generally suspected that she was in danger of being wholly neglected. She wrote to her in a strain of tenderness and duty that revived all the ill-judging parents' affection, who invited her to make her a visit in her little retreat, and promised her a favorable reception even from Sophia herself. Sophia was indeed far from opposing this visit. She was rather desirous of drawing her sister thither frequently, with a hope that her example and her arguments might one day influence her to change her conduct. Harriet received this invitation with joy, for such was the depravity of her mind that she exulted in having an opportunity of displaying the grandeur of her dress and equipage to her sister, to her who had made virtuous poverty her choice, and shown that she despised riches when they were to be purchased by guilt. The pride of human nature, says an eminent writer, takes its rise from its corruption as worms are produced by putrefaction. The wretched fallen Harriet was proud. The diamonds that glittered in her hair, the gilt chariot, and the luxurious table, these monuments of her disgrace contributed to keep up the insolence of a woman who, by the loss of her honor, was lower than the meanest of her servants, who could boast of an uncorrupted virtue. Sophia was busily employed upon her embroidery when Harriet, from her gay chariot, alighted at her door. She entered that humble abode of innocence and industry in a kind of triumph, and accosted her sister with a haughty expression of superiority in her looks and air, as if she expected the splendor of her appearance should strike her with awe. Sophia received her with a modest dignity of conscious virtue, and Harriet, though incapable of much reflection, yet soon perceived the miserable figure she made in the presence of such a character, and stood silent and abashed while Sophia contemplated her finery with an eye of pity and of anguish. Harriet, at length recovering herself, asked for her mother, who that moment entered the room. The sight of her daughter's equipage had thrown her into an agreeable flutter of spirits, and she readily pardoned the fine lady all the faults of the ungrateful child. Harriet, emboldened by so kind a reception, proposed to her to accompany her to town, promising to make her abode with her agreeable by every instance of duty and affection. Mrs. Darnley blushed and was silent. Sophia fixed her eyes upon her mother, anxious and impatient for her answer. She cast a timed glance at Sophia. She read in her speaking eyes her sentiments of this proposal, and turning to Harriet, she told her faintly that, not being satisfied with her conduct, it would be very improper for her to countenance it by residing with her. Harriet burst into tears and exclaimed against her sister's malice, who, she said, acted like her most cruel enemy, and sought to ruin her character by estranging herself from her company and preventing her mother from taking notice of her. Sophia, with great gentleness, proved to her that the loss of her reputation was a necessary consequence of her living in a manner unsuitable to her circumstances, that her mother and her, by complying with her request, could not preserve her from censure, but would incur it themselves. "You call me cruel, Harriet," said she, "for estranging myself from your company, but consider a little whether it is not you that are both cruel and unjust. Why would you deprive me of the only reward the world bestows on me, for a life of voluntary poverty? You have exchanged a good name for dress and equipage, and I, to preserve one, subject myself to labor and indignance. You enjoy your purchase, but I should lose mine were I to have that complaisance for you which you require. Leave me my reputation, then, since it is the sole recompense of those hardships to which I willingly submit, and if you wish to recover yours, be contented to be poor like me." Sophia, finding her sister listen to her, though it was sullenly and with downcast eyes, expatiated in a tender manner upon the errors of her conduct and the fatal consequences that were likely to follow. Harriet at length interrupted her with a pert air, and said, she would not be taught her duty by her younger sister. Then turning to her mother, "I hope, madam," said she, "my sister will not have so much power with you as to make you forbid my coming here." She put her handkerchief to her eyes as she said this, to which Mrs. Darnley replied with great vehemence that no person on earth should ever prevail upon her to cast off her child. Sophia was silent, and observing that her presence seemed to lay them under some restraint, she rose up to retire to her work, telling her sister as she passed her that, far from hindering her visits, she would rather encourage her to repeat them often, that she might be convinced it was possible to be happy in a cottage. Harriet laughed and muttered the words romantic and affectation, which Sophia took no notice of, but left her at liberty to converse freely with her mother. Mrs. Darnley talked to her at first in a chiding strain, and affected to assume the authority of a parent, but, a slave to her appetites, she could not resist any opportunity of gratifying them, and Harriet found it no difficult matter to force a present upon her, to supply those expenses which her extravagance and not her wants made necessary. Harriet now came often to the village, and gave it out that she was upon the best terms imaginable with her mother and sister, not doubting but the world would cease to suspect her since Sophia approved her conduct. The frequency and the length of her visits made Sophia entertain hopes of her reformation, since the time she spent with her mother was taken from that dangerous and immoral dissipation which forms the circle of what is called a gay life. For it is with our manners as with our health. The abatement of vice is a degree of virtue. The abatement of disease is a degree of health. Mr. Herbert, being perfectly recovered, filled Sophia with extreme joy by the account he sent her of it, and of his resolution to come and live near her. While she impatiently expected his arrival, and sent many a longing look towards the road, near which her little cottage was situated, she one day saw a gentleman ride by full speed, who in his person and air had great resemblance to Sir Charles Stanley. Her heart, by its throbbing emotion, seemed to acknowledge its conqueror, for poor Sophia was still in love. She loved, though she despaired of ever being happy, and by thus persisting in a hopeless passion, contradicted that maxim, that love, like fire, cannot subsist without continual motion, and ceases to be as soon as it ceases to hope or fear. Sophia, not able to remove her eyes from the place where she fancied she had seen Sir Charles, continued to look fixedly towards the road, and was beginning to believe she had been mistaken, when a servant in Sir Charles's livery rode by also, and put it out of doubt that she had really seen the master. This unexpected incident awakened 1,000 tender melancholy ideas in her mind, and finding herself too much softened, she had recourse again to her work, to divert her imagination from an object she had vainly endeavored to forget. To be concluded in our next. End of section 38.
Section 39 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kristen Hand. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, by Charlotte Lennox. The Judgment of Paris, a poem. Sent to the author of the Ladies' Museum by a friend. Nobis forma placet, sapientia regna valete. Daughters of Jove, immortal nine, inspire this artless bosom with celestial fire. Graces that in the cheeks of Venus shine, bloom in my numbers and inform each line. So may I challenge the contested bays and charm the ear when beauty claims the lays. On a green turf reclined, lo, Paris lies, and from his pipe melodious sounds arise. His music sweetly charms the hours away, while beauty's power employs his tuneful lay. He sung, when wounded by Alcmena's eyes, how in a borrowed form Jove gained the prize. And how, when rifling Leda's charms he pressed, concealed in snowy plumes her softer breast. Of heaven's great lord he sung each famed amour, of God subdued by love's superior power. The birds are mute and listen to his song, or in soft echoes his sweet notes prolong. The wandering sheep awhile forget to feed, and stop attentive to his tuneful reed. The gods, too, hearken, and his song approve, but most he charmed the almighty ear of Jove. And now, he said, may all our discords cease, nor female jars disturb celestial peace. See there the judge of beauty now agree, ye lovely rivals, to his just decree. The heavenly beauties his command obey, and conscious of her charms, each wings her way. The golden ball descends, the destined prize, and each alternate meets his wondering eyes. First Jove's great queen with proud commanding air, graceful, not beauteous, draws majestic near. Respect she gains, but ne'er the heart can move. All must admire, but none presume to love. Do then, she cried, these beauties faintly shine, and can those childish charms contend with mine? To me, presumptuous, dare thy rivals prove, to me, the sister and the wife of Jove. If crowns, if power, if titles, honors, praise, the regal purple or the hero's bays, have charms to move, behold, I give 'em all. All shall wait thee for that golden ball. And heaven's great queen thy every step shall guard. Honors shall court thee, kingdoms shall reward. Unskilled you are from what a race you spring. That shepherd's dress perhaps conceals a king. 'Tis I must seat thee on thy injured throne, and make rebellious crowds their monarch own. I'll make each vanquished tyrant tribute pay, and every nation stoop beneath thy sway. But if these offers fail to move thee, dread an injured queen's just vengeance on thy head. A sure resentment my repulse shall wait. My smile is heaven, but my frown is fate. Thus Juno spoke. See Pallas next appear. Pallas with decent steps drew slowly near. No studied phrase, she said, my cause requires. Wisdom, the truth, though unadorned, admires. Nor shall I venture like a treacherous guide the dangerous turnings of my path to hide. Nor tempt with honors, nor allure with joy. Honors will fail, and pleasure soon will cloy. Virtue and wisdom, attributes of heaven, those sister beauties, those to me are given. Virtue alone true happiness can give, and wisdom only teach us how to live. These are my gifts. I also join the fight, and guide the godlike hero's blows aright. I, crowned with laurels from successful war, lead him triumphant in the gilded car. Nor less my beauty, though concealed with care, nor, though more manly than my sex, less fair. Mine is each winning art and every charm that with soft passion can the bosom warm. Behold these hands, do they to Juno's yield, one waves the weapon, and one grasps the shield. And this face, which gods in vain adore, this breast, which none have ever viewed before. A weighty breastplate this soft bosom bears, this virgin brow a massy helmet wears. Speak, shepherd, be in this one suit, my friend. Thee virtue, valor, wisdom shall attend. The admiring gods look down, well pleased to see the image of themselves appear in thee. She spoke, the shepherd doubts, the dubious scales hung wavering, nor disclose who most prevails. But when bright Venus drew aside her veil, the shepherd's eyes o'erpowered with beauties fail. As when Sol, late eclipsed, illumes the skies, his beams dart powerful on the weakened eyes. Our dazzled sight shrinks from the glittering ray, and droops beneath the o'erwhelming tide of day. The powerful cestus, negligently placed, with diamonds buckled round her slender waist. Her sparkling eyes with killing luster grow, and her fair cheeks unbidden beauties show. Unstudied charms her winning motion grace, and modest nature purpled o'er her face. Thus in soft music she allures his ear. Ay, why that bashful blush, those signs of fear? For now the shepherd felt the tender heat, and his fond heart irregularly beat. His quicker pulse and trembling nerves confessed the rising tumults of his raptured breast. Can aught forbidding in these eyes appear, or love inspire the ungentle passion, fear? Paris, then hear, and oh, if ever love had charms that could thy tender bosom move, grant me this suit, or henceforth may you find the Idalian nymphs to all your vows unkind. Oh, were I skilled thy listening ear to move, and sweetly formed to bend the soul to love, then smiles and winning words the prize might gain, nor others triumph, while I sue in vain. Nor yet, if looks the secret soul confess, when Paris judges, need I fear success? Thine are love's triumphs, and the nymph who views that radiant form but coldly can refuse. Yet in thy breast, perhaps, love never reigns, stranger to all its joys and all its pains. The half-consenting blush, the glance betrayed, and the soft whisper of the yielding maid, the flame-inspiring touch, the melting eyes, and the 10,000 tender niceties, that lovers only feel, to none is known, the bliss of madness, but the mad alone. But if some happy nymph has found the art to point her charms aright and wound thy heart, thy longing eye shall not in vain adore, but she alike shall taste my mighty power. I am the queen of love, 'tis I inspire the rising sigh, fond thought, and soft desire. In the fair cheek bid speaking blushes rise, and the kind languish grace the yielding eyes. Bid tender wishes warm the virgin soul, and the fair bosom grant without control. Had only Helen power thy heart to gain, e'en Helen's self should joy to ease your pain. Helen, the prize to which ambition soars, Helen, whose charms each wishing heart adores. Jove's beauteous daughter shall thy conquest be, and lose e'en crowns and fame, the world for thee. The boy, transported with joyful pride, sprung up and in a sudden rapture cried, O give me, goddess, charms like thine to view, fame, wisdom, valor, trifling toys, adieu. End of section 39.
Section 40 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, by Charlotte Lennox. The Life of Sir Anthony Van Dyck. The following Life of Van Dyck is published from a manuscript communicated to the author of the Ladies' Museum by a person of distinction. Anthony Van Dyck was born in the city of Antwerp in the year 1599. His father was a merchant of linen cloth. His mother employed herself in embroidery, which, requiring some small knowledge in design, she taught her son in the best manner she could the first rudiments of drawing, in which he made so quick progress that he soon became capable of giving instructions to his former tutor. His mother conceived so great hopes of his future advancement in the arts that she persuaded his father to place him with Rubens, who was the most celebrated painter of that time. Van Dyck soon became a favorite of his master's, not only for his good behavior and ingenious disposition, but from the real advantage he was likely to find in having a scholar that would so soon be capable of assisting him. The first thing Rubens set him about was to make a drawing after his picture of the Battle of the Amazons, in which he succeeded so well that, from that very drawing, the print which is so much admired was engraved. After this, Rubens thought it time to instruct him in the art of coloring, that he might likewise be of assistance to him in painting. He first employed him in copying his works, in which he acquitted himself so well that his master, after giving a few touches, sold them as his own performance. He soon after made so great progress that he executed great works in colors from his master's designs, and afterwards from his own invention, particularly the history of Achilles, which was intended for a suit of tapestry. It is reported that Rubens got no less than £10 a day by the labors of his ingenious disciple. Rubens began now to be not a little alarmed at the extraordinary talents he discovered in his disciple, and with good reason, fearing he might rival his renown, advised him, after bestowing great commendations on some portraits Van Dyck had just finished, to apply himself entirely to the study of portrait painting, and at the same time continually recommending to Van Dyck those who applied for their portraits to himself. He in a great measure stifled that true spirit and genius of painting which ought to have been exerted in the invention and composition of history. Thus Titian, but a little more barbarously, banished Tintoret from his house, a practice often used by the great masters, but as unsuccessful as malicious. For strength of genius, like a spark of fire, will at last blaze up, and perhaps with greater force from its meeting with opposition. The first picture Van Dyck painted after he had withdrawn from the school of his master was for the Church of Dominic. The subject was that of our Savior bearing the cross on his knees, accompanied by the two Marys, with soldiers conducting him to Mount Calvary. This work is much in the style of his master. He now began to think it time to visit Italy, and accordingly set out for Venice, where he applied himself wholly to the study of the Venetian art of coloring, particularly the works of Titian and Paul Veronese, the same fountains that had before so liberally supplied his master. He copied many historical pictures for his improvement, and painted portraits for his subsistence, but the former producing no money, and the latter not sufficient for his expenses, he thought fit to remove to Geneva, where he found the greatest encouragement for his talent of portrait painting. Notwithstanding which, being determined to visit Rome, he undertook that journey, and at his arrival there is entertained in the court of Cardinal Bentivoglio, a great favorer of the Flemish nation, having himself lived there a considerable time and writ the history of that country. In return for the civility he received, he drew his patron's picture whole length, which is now in the Palazzo Pitti at Florence, and esteemed one of the best of Van Dyck's works. He drew also, for the same cardinal, Christ dying on the cross. Sir Robert Shirley, arriving at Rome about this time, with the character of ambassador from Abba, king of Persia, to Gregory XV. Van Dyck drew his picture and his wife's, both in the Persian habit, which bizarre kind of dress gave a new luster to the usual graces of his painting. There was many of Van Dyck's countrymen at that time studying at Rome, and it was a custom amongst them that a newcomer should always invite his countrymen and brother students to a supper, where in the midst of their mirth they used to give him a nickname by which he was ever after to be known. This kind of revel Van Dyck refused, which they took so ill at his hands that since he would not submit to receive any other name, they were resolved to give him that of ambitious, and they took all occasions to condemn in him his pride and his art together. In reality, Van Dyck had a certain stateliness and gravity in his air, which might easily be mistaken for pride. His manner of behavior, the richness of his habits, with the number of his servants, seemed all too high for his employment. This fault, if it is one, is very pardonable, having been used to such magnificence in the school of his master Rubens whilst he was there, conversing mostly with noblemen and people of the higher fashion, and being himself of a temper somewhat elevated, he was naturally led to model himself on their behavior. The true reason of Van Dyck's journey to Rome appears to be not so much to study as to show his excellence in his art, but meeting with too much hatred and ill will from his countrymen, and not so much encouragement from others as he expected, he left Rome and returned to Genoa, which he used to call his home, and there his reputation and profit were very considerable. He drew most of the noblemen and senators of the place, particularly the family of the Ragi. End of section 40.
Section 41 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, by Charlotte Lennox. The Tale of GENEURA, from the Italian of Lodovico Ariosto, in the 5th book of his Orlando Furioso. The noble Rinaldo, sailing to England, whither he was sent on an embassy by the Emperor Charlemagne, a violent storm arose, which continuing 2 days and nights, drove him at last on the coast of Scotland. His fleet arriving safe, he ordered his retinue to meet him at Berwick. He himself, without any attendants, struck into the famous forest of Caledonia, not without a hope of meeting with some adventure worthy his courage and virtue. While he was pleasing himself with this expectation, sometimes riding and sometimes walking a slow pace leading his horse, night drew on, and he now began to think it necessary to go in quest of a lodging. Perceiving an abbey at some distance, he remounted his horse and rode up to it. The abbot and his monks, seeing a stranger of a noble appearance at their gate, came out, and with great civility invited him to pass the night there. Rinaldo gratefully accepted their offer, and being conducted to a chamber, and an elegant repast served to the table, as soon as he had satisfied the cravings of an appetite made eager by travel and long fasting, he inquired of the good fathers what noble exploits in arms had been lately performed in their neighbourhood, and whether a warrior might hope to find any occasions there of signalizing his valour. "'Tis certain," replied the abbot, "that many great and wonderful adventures have been achieved in this forest. But as the place, so are the actions obscure and buried in oblivion. However, if honour be your pursuit, the present time affords you a fit opportunity to acquire it. The danger indeed is great, but if you succeed, eternal fame will be your reward. The young and beautiful Genneura, the daughter of our king, is accused by a knight named Lurcanio of having violated her chastity, and it is provided by our Scottish laws that all damsels, of what rank soever, who are publicly charged with incontinence, shall suffer the punishment of fire, unless a champion be found who will undertake their defence and fight with their accuser. Genneura, in consequence of this law, has been adjudged to die, and only a month's space allowed her to procure a defender of her life and honour. The king, anxious for his daughter's safety, but more for her reputation, has caused it to be proclaimed throughout his dominions that by whatever person, provided his birth be not absolutely base, his daughter shall be delivered from the danger that threatens her, to him he will give the princess in marriage, with a portion suitable to her high rank and quality. This enterprise, noble stranger, is worthy your youth, your courage, and generosity. The law of arms requires all true knights to undertake the defence of injured and oppressed ladies, and surely a fairer than Genneura is not to be found from one extremity of the globe to the other, nor, if common opinion may be relied on, a chaster. "And is it possible," said Rinaldo after a little pause, "that this fair princess is condemned to die for having generously rewarded the passion of a faithful lover? Cursed be the makers of so hard a law, more cursed they that are influenced by it. For me it matters not whether Genneura be justly or unjustly accused. What has been imputed to her as a crime, were I her judge, she should be applauded for, had she taken care to have avoided discovery. But as it is, I am resolved to defy her accuser to combat, and I trust shall be able to deliver her from the unjust and cruel punishment she has been doomed to." The abbot and monks, overjoyed that they had procured a champion for their princess, bestowed 1,000 praises on Rinaldo for his generous design, and he, full of impatience to begin the glorious enterprise, being furnished by his hosts with a guide, set out early the next morning for the Scottish court, leaving the good fathers charmed with his courage and gallantry, and offering up repeated prayers to heaven for his success. As they were pursuing their journey through by-roads for the greater expedition, a cry as of some person in distress roused all their attention. Instantly Rinaldo clapped spurs to his horse, and galloping towards the place from whence the noise proceeded, he came to a deep valley surrounded with trees, through the branches of which he perceived a young maid struggling to free herself from the hands of 2 Russians, who were attempting to murder her. Transported with rage at this sight, the generous Rinaldo flew to the relief of the distressed damsel. His appearance so terrified the intended murderers that they left their prey and fled with the utmost precipitation. Meantime the maid recovered from her fright, thanked her deliverer with a transport of joy and gratitude, and was beginning to acquaint him with the story of her misfortunes, when he, who had not alighted, being eager to pursue his journey, commanded his guide to take her up behind him. And as they travelled, having at leisure observed her countenance and behaviour, he was so much struck with the beauty of the one, and the soft and gentle modesty of the other, that his curiosity was awakened, and he became solicitous to know by what means she had been brought into so cruel a situation. His request being enforced with kind assurances of future protection, the damsel, with a low voice and eyes cast down in a graceful confusion, began in this manner: "Since you, my generous deliverer, have commanded me to relate my misfortunes, prepare to hear a tale more full of horror
an act of greater villainy and baseness than Athens, Thebes, or Argos ever knew. Ah, it is no wonder that our barren clime is cursed with a long winter's ceaseless rage. Phoebus disdains to shine upon a land where such inhuman crimes are perpetrated, deeds black as darkness and fit to be covered with everlasting night. Unhappy as I am, I bore but too great a share in those I am going to relate. From my earliest youth I was brought up in the palace with the daughter of our king, honoured with a near attendance on her person, and happy in the possession of her affection and esteem. Long might I have enjoyed this delightful situation, but love, that ever so sweet a passion should prove the source of so much misery. Love interrupted my tranquillity, subjected my whole soul, and gave me up to guilt, to shame, and unavailing penitence. The Duke of Alban was the object of my virgin wishes. My youth and person pleased him, skilled as he was in every deluding art by which the false and the designing part of his sex betray the unexperienced of ours. Is it any wonder that I was deceived? Fond of believing what I wished and judging of his passion by my own, I yielded to his desires, and vainly hoped this sacrifice of my honour would secure to me forever the possession of his heart. Our guilty commerce lasted some months, during which time I always received his visits in a summer apartment belonging to the princess my mistress, into which, as it was now the most rigid season of the year, she never entered. And being also in a part of the palace little frequented, and the windows opposite to some ruined houses, my lover could come thither unobserved, and by the help of a silken cord which I let down to him, easily ascend the chamber. All sense of virtue being now subdued, and my whole soul sunk in a dear lethargic dream of pleasure, I never once suspected that as my passion increased, that of my lover was decreasing. Ah, my too violent love favoured his deceit, or soon I might have perceived that he feigned much and loved but little. At length, notwithstanding my prepossession, his coldness became visible. I sighed, I wept, I reproached. Alas, how unavailing are all endeavours to revive a decaying passion, satiated by possession and constant only to inconstancy. Polyneso, so was my faithless lover named, languished in secret for the bright Geneura, my royal mistress. I know not if this passion commenced before my ruin was completed, or whether her more powerful charms was the cause of his infidelity. But certain it is that, relying on the fervent love I bore him, he made no scruple to confess his flame, even to me, urging me by all the arguments his wicked mind could suggest, to move the heart of Geneura in his favour. O my lord, judge if this cruel man was dear to me, ever solicitous to procure his happiness, and soothed by his assurances that ambition was the prevailing motive of his address to the princess, in which, if he succeeded, he vowed to keep me still his, and that I should share with her his person and his heart. I consented to all he proposed, and following his instructions, took all opportunities of praising him to my mistress. The Duke of Alban was the constant subject of my discourse. I extolled his valour, his generosity, his illustrious birth, the manly graces of his person, the mingled sweetness and dignity of his manners. The charming theme transported me out of myself. With eager pleasure I ran over all his virtues, dwelt with delight on every imputed charm. Scarce could my tongue keep pace with the overflowings of my love-sick fancy, fond of the dear indulgence of talking in a personated character of him I loved. But when, in compliance with his injunctions, I ventured to insinuate his passion for her, then only did I speak with coldness and restraint. Slowly the unwilling words found way, checked by my rising sighs and prefaced by my blushes. My emotions could not have been hid from an interested observation. But the princess was not only wholly indifferent to Polineso, but indulged a secret passion for the all-accomplished Ariodante. This young knight, an Italian by birth, came with his brother to the court of Scotland, either in pursuit of glory or to transact some secret business with the king. To the graces of his form, than which nature never made one more lovely, is added a mind fraught with whatever is most great and excellent in mankind. His valour never yet found an equal in our land. His is the prize at every tournament, his the foremost honours of the field, in peace the ornament of our court, in war the defender of our country. The king, to whom he had endeared himself by 1,000 services, loaded him with riches and honours, and gave him the first employments in the kingdom. The hill of Sicily burns not with fiercer fires, nor glows Vesuvius with more ardent flames than those which the bright eyes of our princess kindled in the heart of Ariodante. I soon discovered that GENEURA approved, encouraged, and returned his passion. And being, as you may easily imagine, not greatly concerned at this obstacle to the desires of my faithless duke, I acquainted him with all I knew, and from the apparent impossibility of his ever succeeding in his attempt, drew arguments to induce him to give it over. Polineso, naturally haughty and vindictive, could not bear with patience the thoughts of being rejected for a stranger, every way, as he conceived, his inferior. Disdain, shame, rage by turns engrossed his soul, and banished thence every softer passion. His love for GENEURA was now converted to the most obstinate hatred, and he resolved to accomplish her ruin by the blackest treason that ever was conceived in the heart of man. His scheme of revenge concerted, in which I, alas, though ignorantly, was to act the chief part. He one day accosted me with an air more tender and affectionate than usual. "My dear Delinda," said he, "generous and kind as you have been to me, well may you think yourself injured by my inconstancy. But as trees, you know, when cropped by the pruner's hand, shoot out into fresh luxuriant branches, so on the root of my passion for GENEURA young buds of fondness rise, and all the ripening fruit is yours. Nor do I languish so much for the possession of GENEURA's beauties, as I disdain to be thus rejected and contemned. And lest this grief should prey too forcibly on my heart, do thou, my fair, indulge my sick fancy with a kind deceit, and in the dress of that too haughty charmer receive me to thy arms. When the princess is retired to bed, put on her robes, adorn thee with her richest jewels, with her girdle bind thy swelling bosom, let her coronet glitter on thy beauteous brow, and beneath it lay thy hair descend in graceful curls like hers. Then in her borrowed form attend my coming at the well-known window. Thus shall my pride be gratified, and my capricious fancy pleased." Without reflecting on the insidious purport of this request, I promised to comply with it, and for many successive nights received him in the habit he described. Having thus wrought me to his wish, his wicked arts were next played off on Ariodante. Before the Duke had any knowledge of his passion for the princess, he had lived in strict friendship with his young knight, and thence took occasion to reproach him with a breach of it by presuming to address the princess. "In you," said he, "I little expected a rival, as well on account of your attachment to me as the improbability of your succeeding in your attempt. for you are not now to be told of the mutual passion that has long joined Genera's heart and mine, nor that I intend soon to ask the king's consent to espouse her. Why then do you fondly thrust yourself between me and my almost certain happiness? How differently should I act were I in your place?" "Why this to me, my lord?" replied Ariodante hastily. "'Tis you who have betrayed our friendship. You have commenced my rival, not I yours. I claim a prior right in fair Genera, as having loved her first, and have been happy enough to inspire her with an equal flame. This you might have perceived, had you not been blinded by obstinacy. Since then the laws of friendship demand one of us to yield. Be yours the task, as having less right to persist, and less hope of succeeding than myself. In riches indeed you are my superior, but the king's favour is equally shared betwixt us, and in the heart of Genera the advantage is wholly mine." "What errors does not love occasion?" replied the Duke. "Each thinks himself the happy object of her wishes, and yet 'tis certain that one only is loved. Thus, then, let us decide the contest. He who can give the most certain proofs of your affection shall be left by the other in the free and undisturbed possession of it. But first, let us bind ourselves by the most solemn oaths not to disclose each other's secrets." To this Ariodante with trembling impatience agreed, and the artful Duke went on in this manner. "'Tis now almost 5 months since the beauteous Genera rewarded my ardent love with the possession of her person. Oft has the conscious Queen of Night lent me her shades to guide me to my charmer, and seen me happy in her arms." "'Tis false, by heaven!" interrupted Ariodante, transported with rage. "Not that cold queen, whose name thou hast profaned, is chaster than my Genera. Traitor, with my good sword I'll prove thou liest. Take notice, I defy thee to mortal combat, and will with thy dearest blood wash away the slanders thou hast thrown upon my princes." "Moderate your rage," said the calm villain. "I mean to give you proofs, convincing proofs, of what I have said. Your own eyes shall be witnesses of the favours I enjoy." The unhappy Ariodante, pale, trembling, and lost in speechless grief and horror at those fatal words, stood for some moments fixed in racking thought, like the sad statue of despair. Then, raising his eyes overflowing with tears to heaven, and passionately striking his groaning breast, "And can it be," he cried, "that my Genera, that princess whom I loved, whom I adored with such pure reverence as mortals pay to deities, should become the prey of loose desires, and give her faithful Ariodante to death? Oh, 'tis impossible! Though a god spoke it, I should say 'twere false." "Incredulous man," said Polyneiso, "have I not offered to give thee proofs that cannot be denied? Thy eyes shall see the favours she bestows on me." "I take you at your word," resumed Ariodante impatiently. "Give me to behold her guilt, and I am satisfied." "Tomorrow night," said the Duke, "I have an appointment with her. I will conduct you to a place from whence, unperceived, you yourself shall behold me ascend her chamber window, and judge by the reception she gives me if I am happy in her favour." To this the almost distracted Ariodante consented, and at the appointed time followed the Duke to those ruined houses I mentioned before, and there stood concealed from view. Being doubtful of Polyneiso's intentions, he had ordered his brother Lurcanio to arm and go with him, directing him to stay at a convenient distance, so as to be within call if any treachery was offered him, but not in sight of Genera's window, for he would have no witness of her guilt but himself. The Duke, having placed Ariodante most conveniently for his purpose, advanced and gave the usual sign. Unhappy as I am, I heard and eagerly obeyed the welcome summons. adorned in Genera's richest robes, and covered with a veil that princesses only wear, I appeared at the window and threw the silken ladder over to my lover. Lurcanio, either fearing for his brother's safety or desirous of prying into his secrets, quitted his appointed station, and, unperceived by him, walked softly forward till he came within 10 paces of Ariodante. And now my faithless duke was seen by both the brothers, though known only to Ariodante, to ascend the ladder and gain the chamber window, at which I met him with a tender embrace, wandering over his lips and eyes with eager kisses. This sight so inflamed the soul of Ariodante with rage and grief, that drawing out his sword and fixing the pommel of it in the ground, he was going to rush with all his force upon the point, had he not been prevented by Lurcanio, who, perceiving his rash design, sprang to him in an instant, and having thrown aside the fatal instrument of death, received his sinking brother in his arms. "Ah, miserable brother," said Lurcanio, "by what wild fury art thou possessed, to fall thus meanly for a woman? Now cursed, for ever cursed be all the kind. May they all perish in one wide ruin, blown as they are, like clouds, with every blast of wind. And this fair mischief that has betrayed thee, let us devise some glorious vengeance for her. Let not thy noble life be sacrificed to her falsehood. Hers is the crime, be hers the punishment. Proclaim her guilt aloud, accuse her to the king. My eyes as well as thine have seen her infamy, and with my sword I'll make good thy assertion." Ariodante, whose soul was torn with various and conflicting passions, smiled gloomily at the mention of revenge. Awhile he seemed to bury every thought of grief and of despair in that one hope of sacrificing the guilty princess to his wrongs. But alas, the cureless wound remained behind. Genera, base as she appeared, he loved with such unceasing fondness that, wholly unable to endure her loss, and dreading no hell like that within his bosom, once more he resolved to die. To Lurcanio, however, he dissembled his design, and went home with him at his request. But early the next morning he departed, leaving no traces behind him from whence it might be gathered to what place he was gone. Lurcanio, dreading the fatal effects of his despair, was pierced to his inmost soul at the news of his flight. The king and the whole court took part in his affliction. No methods were left untried to discover where he was. Messengers were sent in search of him to the utmost extremities of the kingdom, but all returned without any success. At length a peasant came to court, and at his request was introduced to the princess, who informed her that as he was travelling to the city he met Ariodante, that this unhappy knight obliged him to follow him and be witness of a deed he was going to perform, that, obeying his orders, they journeyed on together till they came to a steep rock that hung pendant over the sea, fronting the Irish island. Ariodante, said the peasant, ascending this rock, commanded me to observe well what he did, to give you an account of it, and tell you his last words, which were that he had seen too much. Then, springing furiously from the top of the rock, he precipitated himself into the sea. Terrified at the dreadful sight, I hastily turned back, and travelled hither to bring you the fatal news. Genera, overwhelmed with grief and amazement for the death of her lover, and the strange message he had sent her, abandoned herself to the most violent excesses of despair. She beat her beauteous bosom, tore her hair, and in the wildness of her woe 1,000 times invoked the dear loved name of Ariodante, repeated the mysterious words he uttered, and as often called on death to end her. The news of his death, with the sad manner of it, spread grief and consternation through the whole city. Even the remotest parts of Scotland felt and lamented the loss of their valiant defender. The king and the whole court bewailed his loss with the sincerest sorrow, but Lurcanio, superior in grief, as more nearly interested in the dear deceased, mourned his unhappy brother with all the tenderness of fraternal love and all the warmth of friendship. Revolving in his mind the fatal adventure of the window, which had been the cause of his brother's destruction, the desire and hope of revenge afforded some relief to the poignancy of his woe, and obstinately bent to sacrifice the princess to the manes of his Ariodante, he presented himself before the king and council and accused her of incontinence, relating all that Ariodante and he had seen, and the fatal effects it had upon him. He then reminded the king of the Scottish laws against unchastity, and loudly demanded justice on the princess. Horror and amazement seized the soul of the unhappy father. Genera, though dearer to him than life, though innocent in his opinion, he has not power to screen from the danger that threatens her. The laws, indeed, permit the accused to have a champion to fight in her defense, by whom, if the prosecutor, who is obliged to maintain by force of arms the truth of his assertion, is worsted, she is declared guiltless of the crimes laid to her charge. To this only remedy the king has recourse, and causes it to be proclaimed throughout his dominions, that if any knight of noble birth will undertake the defence of his daughter, and by force of arms shall vanquish her accuser, on him he will bestow the princess with a dower suitable to her quality. Notwithstanding this proclamation, no knight has yet offered himself for the enterprise, deterred therefrom by the known valour of Lurcanio. The king, no less anxious for Genera's reputation than her life, caused all her maids to be brought to a trial, who with one voice declared they never were privy to any intrigue of the royal mistress. Alarmed at these proceedings, and dreading the consequence of a further scrutiny, I urged the Duke to take some measures for our common security. He, with dissembled kindness, praised my secrecy and affection, and sent 2 men to conduct me to a castle of his at a great distance from the court. Wholly relying on his faith, I put myself under the protection of those 2 villains, whom the Duke, desirous of removing forever the only person who could discover his guilt, ordered, when they came to a convenient place, to murder me. Happily for me, chance conducted you that way. You delivered me from my impending fate, and while it shall please heaven to preserve my unhappy life, it shall be spent in grateful acknowledgment to my protector."
This account of Genera's innocence was extremely welcome to Rinaldo, for though confiding in his own courage, he was not without hopes of delivering her, guilty as she appeared. Yet the certainty he was going to fight in a just cause animated him with double fires, and gave him almost a confirmation of victory. Now clapping spurs to his horse, he rode on with such eager haste that the noble town of St. Andrews soon appeared in view. There the combat was to be performed. The guards had already surrounded the lists. The challenger's trumpet had sounded, and the unhappy king, pale, trembling, and full of eager anxiety, listened with a beating heart and fear-checked wishes for an accepting answer. Meantime, Rinaldo, having left the frighted Stalinda at an inn, with repeated assurances of gaining her pardon, in case he vanquished the prince's accuser, advanced towards the city gate. Here he was met by a young page, who informed him that an unknown knight, clad all in sable armour, was arrived, that he had demanded the combat with Lurcanio, and declared he would die or free the princess from her ignominious sentence. Rinaldo, impatient to unfold the mystery, thundered at the city gates, which, being opened, he rode eagerly to the lists. There, beholding the combatants engaged, he forced his way through the press, and crying aloud that they should cease the fight, demanded an instant audience of the king. The marshals of the field thereupon parted the 2 champions, and Rinaldo was immediately conducted to the king, to whom he related the whole story of Polineso's treachery as he had received it from Dalinda, adding that he would prove the truth of it by force of arms, and begged that he might be allowed to defy the traitor Duke to single combat. The noble form of Rinaldo, but chiefly the pleasing purport of his speech, gained him absolute credit with the king. Scarce could the raptured parent restrain the wild exultings of his joy for this confirmation of his Genneura's innocence. Dearer than life or empire was she loved by him, and freely would he have sacrificed both to save her honour. He hesitated, therefore, not a moment in permitting the requested combat, but ordered Duke Polineso to be called. He, by his office of High Constable, having the ordering of the combat, was riding proudly about the field, exulting in his successful treason, and anticipating in his own mind the ruin of the fair and injured Genneura. Ignorant though he was of the design of this summons, yet coward guilt suggesting the worst he had to fear, with a disordered air and eyes expressive of the various apprehensions that struck his conscious soul, he met the reproachful look of his king and the fierce glances of Rinaldo. The noble warrior, repeating in a few words the treasons he had been guilty of, challenged him to the field. Polineso denied the accusation, but accepting the proffered combat, because he could not avoid it, retired to arm himself, while Rinaldo, fraught with the pious prayers and blessings of the king, entered the lists and ordered his trumpet to sound. At the third blast the Duke appeared. Pale terror and dismay were pictured in his face. His fainting heart throbbed with the conscious pangs of guilt and horrors of impending fate. Confused, distracted, not knowing what he did, he darted forward at the signal given to begin the fight. But his weak lance, ill guided by his trembling hand, fell harmless to the ground. Not so the great Rinaldo. He, with calm courage and brave yet unassuming confidence, meditated the wound, and rising all collected to the blow, threw his famed lance with such unerring skill and force that it pierced quite through the armour of Polineso and hid its fatal point within his side. The traitor fell. Rinaldo eagerly dismounted, and approaching him, unlaced his helmet. With faint, low voice he called for mercy, and thinking to deserve it, confessed unasked the wrong he had been guilty of to Genneura. Then, as if life had been only lent him till he had cleared her innocence, scarce had he uttered another prayer for mercy, but death suppressed the coward's supplication, and he lay a breathless corpse at the feet of Rinaldo. The people, transported with joy that their princess was not only delivered from death, but restored to her former sanctity of character, made the air resound with acclamations. Rinaldo, being conducted to the king, untied the beaver of his helmet, and was immediately known to be the famous knight of Italy, whose noble exploits were noised over all the habitable world. The king embraced him in a rapture of joy and gratitude. The nobles crowded round the deliverer of their princess, loaded him with blessings, and strove to exceed each other in praises of his invincible valor. These congratulations over, all eyes were turned upon the unknown knight in black armour, who had so generously undertaken the defence of Genneura against her accuser Lurcanio. Pensive he stood during the fight between Polineso and Rinaldo, his eyes fixed upon the combatants. With eager attention he had listened to the dying words of the treacherous duke, and while the multitude in loud shouts expressed their joy, and the king and court were paying honours to the glorious victor, he stood apart from the throng, absorbed in thought, and wholly insensible of the tumult around him. The king caused him to be conducted to his presence, and, acknowledging himself greatly obliged to his generous intention, pressed him to let him know in what manner he could repay the obligation. The knight made no answer, but bowing low and throwing off his helmet, the king and court, with the utmost astonishment, beheld the lovely face of Ariodante. Wonder and joy kept them all silent for a while. At length the king, recovering from his surprise, clasped the young warrior to his breast with a tender embrace. "Is it possible," said he, in a tone of voice expressive of the strongest transport, "that I behold again my Ariodant, the gallant defender of my dominions, the brave champion for my daughter's honour, him whom I lamented as dead, whom my whole kingdom mourned for? Tell me by what strange, yet happy chance, I now behold thee living, whose death was so confidently affirmed, and so universally believed." Ariodant, knowing the king was acquainted with the whole story of his love, replied without reserve, "The peasant, my lord, whom I detained to be a witness of the sad effects of my despair, and to bring the news of it to the princess, informed her truly that I cast myself from the rock into the sea. But that natural repugnance we have all to death, when near, however we may despise its terrors at a distance, impelled me involuntarily to use measures to preserve a life which a moment before I had been so desirous of losing. As soon as I rose again upon the surface of the waves, I applied myself to swimming, at which I was very expert, and soon reached the neighbouring shore, faint, weary, and almost breathless. I threw myself down amidst the rushes, and was found in this condition by an ancient hermit, whose cell was at a small distance. Thither he conducted me, and in a few days his charitable cares restored me to my strength. But alas, my mind was tortured still with various passions. Love, hate, despair, and eager thirst of vengeance by turns possessed me. In vain I sought to banish the idea of Geneura from my soul. It still returned with double force. Nor could her infidelity, of which, mistaken wretch that I was, I thought I had such convincing proofs, weaken the power of her resistless charms. Thus, languishing with a cureless wound, I heard the news of her accusation by my brother, and the danger to which her life and honour were exposed. At that moment, forgetting the injuries I had suffered, insensible to all the ties of consanguinity and friendship, and only solicitous for her safety, I determined to fight with my brother in her defence, pleasing myself with the thought that if I did not free her, I should at least have the satisfaction of dying in her cause, and thereby proving how much superior to Polyneices was my love, who, though favoured as he was by her, he wanted courage to defend her. Having provided myself with armour that might effectually conceal me, I came hither full of fury against my brother, whom I could not but consider as my worst enemy, since he was the accuser of the still adored Geneura. The arrival of the brave Rinaldo happily prevented the continuance of a combat which must have ended in the death of one brother and eternal remorse to the other. With joy I behold the princess delivered from the ignominious death with which she was threatened. But oh, with far more rapture do I congratulate your majesty on this discovery of her innocence. Happy Rinaldo, to be at once the defender of her life and restorer of her honour. As for me, I sought only to preserve her from death, and if that was denied me, to have the satisfaction at least of dying in her defence by the hand of a friend and brother. The king, who loved him before for his virtues, was so charmed with this generous proof of his passion for his daughter that he easily yielded to the solicitations of Rinaldo and the noblemen of his court to bestow the princess on so faithful a lover, and endowing her with the duchy of Albania, which on Polyneices' decease reverted to the crown, he gave her hand to Ariodant in the presence of the whole court, and the nuptials were soon after celebrated with the utmost magnificence. Rinaldo, having obtained Delinda's pardon, who retired into a monastery, took leave of the king and happy lovers, and pursued his voyage to England. End of section 41.
Section 42 of The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Amanda Leung. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, by Charlotte Lennox. Treatise on the Education of Daughters, continued. Of the Use of History for Children. Children are very fond of strange stories. It is common to see them in high delight or in tears at the recital of adventures. Fail not to take advantage of this propensity. Whenever you find them disposed to listen, tell them some short, pretty fable, and let it be one relative to the animals, innocent and ingenuously composed. Give them for what they are, fables, and explain the moral design of them. As for the heathen stories, it will be happy for a girl to remain totally ignorant of them all her lifetime, because they are impure and abound with impious absurdities. But if you cannot prevent an acquaintance with some, do your endeavor to inspire an abhorrence of them. When you have told one story, stay till the child asks for another, leaving as it were a craving upon him to be further informed. At length, when his curiosity becomes excited, then have some select pieces of history to relate in a compendious manner. Let there be a connection between them, and tell a particular part one day and another the next, that he may be held in suspense and in impatience to hear the conclusion. Animate your accounts with a lively tone of voice and expression, and make the personages speak. Children of a lively imagination will fancy they both hear and see them. For example, recite the story of Joseph, make the brothers speak like brutish people, Jacob like a fond afflicted father, Joseph in his character taking pleasure, when become the ruler over Egypt, in keeping himself from being known by his brethren, then putting them in dread of him, and at last discovering himself. This natural representation, joined to the wonders of the history, will charm a child, provided he is not cloyed of such things, but left to ask for them, or be promised under the notion of reward. And when he is grown wiser, and provided we never offer them by way of a task, nor oblige them to a repetition, for this is a force upon him, and what will destroy all the pleasure he takes in these historical pieces. However, it is to be observed, that if he hath any degree of facility in speaking, he will be naturally prone to relate to those he loves whatever stories have given him the greatest entertainment. But you are not to set him this for a rule. You may get some person that is free with him to pretend a desire to hear the story. The child will be quite delighted to tell it, and do not seem to mind him, nor take any notice of his mistakes. When he comes to be better practiced, then you may with gentleness observe to him what is the best manner of telling a tale, to make it short, plain, and natural, by the choice of such circumstances as best set forth things as they truly were. If you have a number of children, use them by degrees to represent the several personages in the history they have learned. Let one be Abraham, another Isaac, etc. This personating will delight them beyond other plays, and give them a habit of thinking and speaking serious matters with pleasure, and fix the transactions indelibly in their memory. We ought to endeavor to give them a greater taste for sacred history than for any other, not by commending it as the finest, which perhaps they would not readily believe, but by bringing them to perceive it without a word said. Point out to their observation of what importance it is, how singular, marvelous, replete with natural paintings and nobly spiritus, the articles of the creation, the fall of Adam, the deluge, the call of Abraham, the sacrifice of Isaac, the adventures of Joseph above mentioned, the birth and flight of Moses, are not only proper to awake the curiosity of children, but at the same time that they discover the origin of religion, they also lay the foundations of it in the young mind. It would argue a profound ignorance of the essence of religion not to see that it is entirely historical. For by a web of marvelous facts do we find its establishment, its perpetuity, and all that ought to engage us to the belief and practice thereof. Let it not be imagined that we have any intention that people should dip into science when we propose these histories to them, for they are brief, various, and proper to please the most ordinary understandings. God, who best knows the spirit of man whom he created, hath thrown religion among popular facts, which far from overcharging the simple, assist them rather to conceive and retain the sense of its mystery. For instance, tell a child that in God 3 co-equal persons make but one single nature. By hearing and repeating these terms, he will remember them, but, I doubt, not conceive the sense of them. Tell him then how when Jesus Christ came out of the water of Jordan, the Father caused these words to be heard from heaven. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." Add that the Holy Spirit descended upon our Savior, in a bodily shape like a dove, and you will make him sensibly perceive the Trinity in a passage which he will never forget. Here are 3 persons whom he will ever distinguish by their different actions. You have but to teach him that all taken together constitute but one God. This example suffices to show the use of history, which, though it seems to be a prolix method of instruction, is in reality the most compendious, and avoids the dry way of catechisms, wherein the mysteries are disjoined from the facts, and we may know that in the ancient times they taught by means of history. The admirable method of teaching which St. Austin prescribes was not of that father's introduction. It was the universal practice of the Church. This consisted in demonstrating, by a series of historical facts, religion to be as old as the world. Jesus Christ expected in the Old Testament, Jesus Christ reigning in the New. This is the bottom of Christian instruction. This requires somewhat more time and application than the method of teaching to which some people confine themselves. However, by this series of history, we are brought to a true knowledge of religion, whereas when unacquainted with it, we have but confused notions of Jesus Christ, the Gospel, the Church, and of the foundation of those virtues with which the name of Christian ought to inspire us. The Historical Catechism, printed a little while ago, a plain book, short and much clearer than the common catechisms, includes all necessary to be known on that head, and of this no one will say that it requires a great deal of study. To the passages I have before mentioned, let us add the going through the Red Sea, the sojournment of the people in the desert, where they eat the bread which fell from heaven, and drank of the water which Moses by the stroke of his rod made to spring out of the rock, represent to them the miraculous conquest of the promised land, on which occasion the waters of Jordan turned back toward their source, and the walls of a city fell down of themselves in the view of the besiegers. Paint in natural colors the conflicts of Saul and of David, show the last, while yet a stripling without arms and in his dress of a shepherd, the vanquisher of that proud giant Goliath. Let not be forgotten the glory and wisdom of Solomon, his decision of the dispute between the 2 women about the child, but then describe him fallen from that height of wisdom, dishonoring himself by ease and indulgence, and almost unavoidable consequence of extreme prosperity. Make the prophets speak to the king in the name of the Lord. Let them read futurity as a volume, appear humble, of austere life, and suffering continual persecution for the truth's sake. Place in its due point of time the first destruction of Jerusalem. Describe the temple burned and the holy city ruined for the sins of the people. Relate the captivity in Babylon, where the Jews bewailed their beloved Sion. Before their return, bring in the pleasing relations of what befell Tobit, Judith, Esther, and Daniel. It would have its usefulness if children were brought to declare their thoughts on the different characters of these saints, to know which affected them most. One would prefer Esther, another Judith. This would create a little contention, and so more strongly impress the stories upon their minds and help them form their judgment. After this, bring the people up to Jerusalem and let them repair the ruins thereof. Then form a lovely picture of the peace and prosperity of the city. In a short time after, give the portrait of that cruel and impious Antiochus, who died in hypocritical penitence. Describe the victories of the Maccabees under the reign of that persecutor, likewise the martyrdom of the 7 brethren of the same family. Proceed to the miraculous birth of John the Baptist, then in course recount that of Jesus Christ, after which it will be proper to select out of the Gospels all the most striking passages of his life, his preaching at the temple at 12 years of age, his baptism, his retreat into the wilderness, and temptation, his calling the apostles, the miracle of the loaves, the conversion of that woman sinner that anointed his feet with precious unguent, washed them with her tears, and dried them with her hair. Tell how he taught the Samaritan woman who cured the man born blind, raised Lazarus from the dead. Show Jesus Christ entering triumphant into Jerusalem. Show him upon the cross, and at length rising out of the sepulchre. After this, it should be remarked with how much familiarity he consorted with his disciples for 40 days together, even till they beheld him ascend up into heaven. Besides this, the descent of the Holy Ghost, the stoning of St. Stephen, the conversion of Paul, the calling of the centurion Cornelius, the travels of the apostles, and particularly of St. Paul, are exceedingly engaging. Choose out the most wonderful stories of the martyrs and something in general of the heavenly life of the primitive Christians, interspersed with instances of the courage of young virgins, the astonishing austerities of the hermits, the conversion of the emperors and of the empire, the blindness of the Jews and their terrible punishment, which lasteth to this day. These narrations will, in a delightful manner, impress on the tender and lively imagination of a child an entire series of religion from the creation of the world to our days. Give them noble ideas of it, and such as will never be effaced. They will perceive likewise that in history the hand of God ever lifted up to deliver the righteous and to confound the wicked. They will be used to see God the efficient cause in all things, drawing imperceptibly into his designs those of his creatures that seem most repugnant to them. But as to this collection of extracts, let it consist of such as afford the pleasantest, the most magnificent images, for we should by all means so manage it that children may find religion charming, lovely, venerable, whereas their common notion of it is something melancholy, flat, and doleful. Besides the inestimable benefit of thus teaching them religion, all these delightful narrations, so early infused into their memories, awaken a curiosity to be informed of things in their nature serious, render them sensible to the pleasures of the understanding, and interest them in whatever parts of history happen to bear any relation to such as they have already learned. Yet, I say again, great care must be taken never to lay it down for a rule, as they must attend to you. You must remember all, much more, never to prescribe stated lessons. No, let pleasure affect everything. Do not urge them, and you will bring it to bear. Even for ordinary understandings, the point is not to overcharge them, but wait the gradual rise of their curiosity. But it will be objected to relate these several parts of history in a lively, concise, natural, and pleasing manner. Where are the governesses capable of it? To which I answer that, in proposing it, I mean that people should endeavor to procure for their children persons of good parts, and put them as much as possible into this method of teaching. And so every governess will perform according to her talent. But still, whatever her capacity is, matters will not go quite so wrong when this natural and plain method is in practice. To their narrations they may add the sight of prints or pictures representing the sacred stories. Prints will serve for general use. But if there should be an opportunity of showing the children good pictures, let it not be neglected, for the glow of colors and size of figures as big as the life strike the imagination with much greater force. End of section 42.
Section 43 of the Ladies Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Prajakta. The Ladies Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. The Ladies' Geography. Description of the island of Ceylon, continued from page 720. All the kinds of fruits which the Indies in general produce are found in this island. It has, however, some peculiar to itself, among which one of the most particular is the jax, a fruit which is of very great service in food. It grows on a very high tree, is of a greenish color, covered over with prickles, and is about the size of a loaf of 18 pounds weight. Its seeds, or what they call its eggs, are disposed in the inside of it like the seeds of a gourd. They eat the jax as we eat cabbage, and its taste is not extremely unlike it. When it is ripe, it may be eaten raw, and one of them is sufficient for 6 or 7 people. The grain or eggs resemble chestnuts very much, both in color and taste. They may be eaten either boiled or roasted in ashes. One jax produces 2 or 3 quarts of them, and the inhabitants always keep store of them by them. The joms is another fruit which is peculiar to the island. It has the taste of an apple, is very full of juice, and is no less wholesome than agreeable. Its color is white, mixed with red in a manner that appears to be the work of an elegant pencil. There are also several wild fruits which are to be met with in their woods. Add the mucrose, which are round, of the size of a cherry, and of a very agreeable taste. The dongs, which resemble black cherries, the ambelotes, which may be compared to our gooseberries, the carolades, cabellas, tooks, and jollards, which may pass for so many sorts of very good plums, and the paragits, which are not unlike our pears. The island of Ceylon produces 3 trees, which, though their fruits are not indeed fit to eat, are no less remarkable for other conveniences. The first, which is named Talipot, is very straight and in height and thickness nearly resembles the mast of a ship. Its leaves are so large that a single one will cover 15 or 20 men and shelter them from the rain. They grow stronger as they dry without becoming less pliable or manageable. Nature could scarcely have bestowed any gift on the inhabitants more valuable than this, although the leaves are so very extensive when open, they can be folded up like a fan, and being then not thicker than one's arm, weigh very little in the hand. Their shape is round, but the Ceylonese cut them into triangular pieces wherewith they cover themselves when they travel, taking care to place the pointed end before them, which therefore makes its way the easier through the shrubs. The soldiers make tents of them. These leaves grow at the top of the tree like those of the cocoa, but what is very extraordinary, it bears no fruit till the year of its death, at which time alone it puts forth large branches laden with very beautiful yellow flowers, but of a very strong and offensive smell, which changes into a round hard fruit of the size of our largest cherries, but which are good for nothing but to sow. Thus the till pot bears but once, but then it is so loaded with fruit at that time that one tree is sufficient for the sowing of a whole province. Yet the smell of the flower is so insufferable near houses that they seldom fail to cut down the tree so soon as it begins to put forth buds, especially as at that time, if they are cut, there is found within them an exceeding good sap which may be reduced to meal and made up in cakes that have the taste of white bread. This is also another resource of the inhabitants when the rice harvest happens to turn out indifferently. The second of these trees is the Kittula, which grows as straight as the cocoa, but not so tall and by many degrees slenderer. Its principal singularity consists in its yielding a kind of liquor which is called telgi, very sweet, wholesome, and agreeable, but without any strength. The liquor they connect twice a day, and from some of the best trees 3 times. The quantity of the whole frequently amounting to 6 quarts in a day. They boil it up till it acquires the consistence and appearance of dark powdered sugar, and this the inhabitants call jaggery. With very little more trouble they might render it as white as sugar, to which in every other respect it is no way inferior in goodness. The manner of getting this liquor is as follows. When the tree comes to its maturity, it puts forth towards its extremities a little button which changes into a round fruit and is, properly speaking, the seed. This button they open, putting into it various ingredients such as salt, pepper, citron, garlic, and various kinds of leaves, which prevent it from ripening so soon as it would otherwise do. Every day at certain times, they cut off a little piece towards the end of this, from which place the liquor flows out in abundance. As this button ripens and withers, others grow lower and lower every year, till they at length reach the bottom of the branches. But when this comes to be the case, which is in about 8 or 10 years, the tree ceases to bear and presently after dies. Its leaves resemble those of the cocoa palm and are covered with a kind of bark extremely hard and full of filaments, which are employed in the making of ropes. They fall during the whole time that the tree is growing, but when it has arrived at its full dimensions, they remain on it for many years, and when they do fall, are never supplied by any others. The wood, which is seldom above 3 inches thick, serves as envelopment to a very thick pith. It is extremely hard and heavy, but very apt to split off itself. The color of it is black and looks as if it was composed of inlaid work. The Ceylonese make pastils of it to beat the rice whittle. The third extraordinary tree, and indeed what renders this island so extremely valuable to the Dutch, is that which bears the cinnamon. It is called in the language of the country Corunda guha. It grows in the woods indiscriminately with other trees, and what is somewhat extraordinary, the Ceylonese set no extraordinary value upon it. This tree is of a middling bulk. Its bark is the cinnamon, which appears white when on the trunk, but which they take off and dry it in the sun. The islanders gather this only from the smaller trees, although the bark of the larger ones smell as sweet and have as strong a taste. The wood has no smell, it is white and about the hardness of deal, and is used for all kinds of purposes. Its leaf is not unlike that of the laurel, but when it first begins to put forth is of a bright scarlet, and rubbed between the hands has more the smell of a clove gilliflower than that of the cinnamon. The fruit, which usually ripens about September, is like an acorn but smaller and has less both of smell and taste than the bark. They boil them in water in order to extract an oil from them, which swims at the top and, when congealed, becomes as hard as white as tallow and of a very agreeable smell. The inhabitants anoint their bodies with it and also burn it in their lamps, but no candles are made of it but for the king. With respect to animals, the island of Ceylon produces a great variety, namely cows, buffaloes, swine, goats, deer, hares, dogs, jackals, apes, tigers, bears, wild bears, elephants, lions, horses, and asses, but no sheep. Amongst the fallow beasts, they have one called the memima, which is no bigger than a hare, but much resembles a deer. Its color is grey, spotted with white, and its flesh is excellent. The ganvera is a kind of wild buck, which has a very sharp chine. Its 4 feet wide, and half the legs of the same color. Knox gives an account of his having seen one which was kept in the king's magazine, together with a black tiger, a white deer, and a spotted elephant. The apes are not only in prodigious abundance in the woods, but also of many various kinds, whereof there are some very different from any that are to be found in other countries. Some of them are as large as our spaniels, with grey hair and black faces, and long white beards, reaching from ear to ear, which give them greatly the appearance of old men. There are others of the same size, but differing in color, their bodies, faces, and beards being all of a bright white. But as this difference of color does not seem to form any specific difference in the animal, they are both alike named wanderers. They do but little mischief, keeping constantly in the woods, where they feed entirely on leaves and buds. There is another sort called kilowan, which are beardless but have a white face and long hair on their heads, which descend and divide like those of the human species. These kind are extremely mischievous from the continual ravage they commit amongst the grain. The Ceylonese are extremely fond of the flesh of all their kinds of apes, as well as of that of their squirrels, whereof they have also several different species. The variety of ants in the island of Ceylon is no less admirable than their abundance. that which they call cambius and talecambius, are very much like ours in size, with this difference that the first are reddish and the others, which are black, are only to be found in rotten trees and have a very disagreeable smell. There is a third kind called dimbios, which are large and red and make their nests on the branches of large trees in leaves which they amass together to the bulk of a man's head. Several nests are sometimes found on one tree, and the fear of 1,000 dangerous things will then prevent any person from attempting to climb up it. The kaura are a fourth kind of ants. They are large and black, live underground, and form holes there nearly of the shape of rabbit burrows, and the fields are so full of these holes that the cattle are in perpetual danger from them of breaking their legs. A fifth sort are the cod ants. They are of a very fine black, much about the size of the former, and live also in the earth. But they frequently make excursions in very numerous parties without anyone knowing the peculiar period of their expedition. They bite cruelly if hurt or put out of their way, but otherwise, if unmolested, they are very harmless and inoffensive. But the most numerous and at the same time the most extraordinary of all the kinds of ants is that which they call the wackos. The ground is covered with them. They are of a middling size, have a white body and red head, and devour everything that comes in their way. They eat cloth, wood, the straw wherewith the houses are thatched, and, in short, everything but iron and stone. No one dares to leave anything in an uninhabited house. They get up along the walls, making a rind of earth as they go along, which they continue through the whole extent of their way, to what height soever they arrive. If this arcade happens to break, they all immediately return back again to repair their building, and continue their march as soon as they have completed the work. The inhabitants easily perceive their approach by the sight of these little wards, and are obliged to use continual precaution to destroy or drive them away. In places which are without houses, they raise up little mountains of earth of 4, 5, or 6 feet in height, and so strong that it is not easy to destroy them even with a spade. These little huts, which are called humboses, are composed of walls or arcades, and built of very fine earth, which the people make use of for the fabrication of their idols. The Vacos multiply prodigiously, but they also die by myriads. For when they acquire their wings, they take their flight in such inconceivable numbers towards the west that they almost obscure the sky, and rising to so great a height as to be quite lost to the view, they cease not their flight till they drop down dead, exhausted with fatigue. They then become a prey to birds of many kinds, and chickens in particular will feed on them more readily than on even the rice. To be continued. End of section 43.
Section 44 of The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rucker. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. The Ladies' Museum, The Trifler, Number 11. To the author of The Trifler, Madame. My brother, who is a great scholar and writes A.M. after his name, desires me to acquaint you that having with much labor and pains translated the enclosed dialogue from the Greek, he is willing to communicate it to the world in your paper, that the trifling part of your readers, which he supposes to be by far the greater number, may learn that there were trifling, that is, idle people, in the time of Socrates, and may be corrected by the wise admonitions of that great divine. My brother is determined to keep himself concealed, that he may silently and without envy enjoy the reputation of this performance, and therefore recommends it to you to be particularly careful that no mistakes are made in the spelling and pointing. I am your humble servant, unknown. P.S. My brother says Socrates was not a divine, but a philosopher. End of section 44. Section 45 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, by Charlotte Lennox. A dialogue between Socrates and Aristarchus. Socrates, one day observing Aristarchus to look thoughtful and melancholy, said to him, "My friend, something seems to lie heavy upon your mind. You should share the burden with your friends. Perhaps we may be able to assist you." To which Aristarchus replied, "Indeed, Socrates, I am in great perplexity. You know that on account of the war a great multitude have forsaken the open country and fled into the Pyreneum. And there are come to my house so many helpless sisters, nieces, and cousins, that I have not less than 14 gentlewomen. Now from our landed estates we get nothing, for the enemy is master there, nor from rent of houses. Inhabitants are so thin in the city, furniture nobody will buy, and money there is none to be borrowed. One may as soon expect to find it in walking along the streets as to borrow any. It is grievous, Socrates, to stand and see our relations perish. It is impossible to support such a number of them in such times." Socrates, hearing all this, replied, "And how comes it to pass that Varamo, who has a great family to maintain, not only finds means to provide himself and them with all necessaries, but likewise has so much to spare that he even grows rich by what he vends?" "Good reason," replied the other, "because he keeps slaves, and I gentlefolks." "And of these two sorts of people, which may you reckon the most valuable, his slaves or your gentlefolks?" asked Socrates. "Surely mine," says Aristarchus. "But then is it not a disgrace," says the philosopher, "that while he is thriving by the means of a parcel of slaves, you should be driven to extremity with those that are so much their betters?" "Oh, but," says the other, "he feeds handcraftsmen, I people who have been genteelly brought up." "I suppose you mean by handcraftsmen," replied Socrates, "those who are skilled in preparing the useful things of life." "Yes, I do," said the other. "Is meal in that number?" "Undoubtedly." "And bread?" "Most surely." "And clothes for both sexes, coats, gowns, cloaks, linen?" Questionless, these are all most useful." "Probably," continued Socrates, "your people are not at all skilled in making any of these things." "Oh yes, one or other in all or most of them." "Possibly then," said Socrates, "you don't know that by means of one single article, Nausicles, the mealman, not only maintains himself and several servants, but likewise a great number of hogs and cows, and have so thriven as even to be named for serving the expensive offices of the state, and that Carabas, by his business of a baker, supports a large family, nay, lives in plenty. Then there's Demeas, the tailor, and numbers of Megarians that get a fine livelihood by mercery wear." "Defend me," says the other. "These fellows are owners of many purchased slaves, whom they force to work, and by their labors they thrive. But I tell you I have none but gentry and my relations." "Pray now, because they are gentry and your relations," says Socrates, Do you think they have nothing to do but to eat and sleep? Or among people of the like condition, do you reckon those that live after that manner to pass their time more happily than others that both know and practice the necessary employments of life? Or do you apprehend sloth and idleness to be more conducive toward a man's learning what he ought to understand, or remembering what he has learned, or to his health and strength of body, or, in fine, toward his attaining or preserving the requisites of life, while industry and care are nothing worth? You confess they have been taught to do some of these works. Why? Because they were things of no service, or such as they must never put their hands to, or rather, on the contrary, as what they might one day labor in and profit by, for which makes men the most virtuous, living in idleness, or being engaged in a useful business, or the honestest, the being employed or lazily to be talking how they shall live. Yet more, it is my opinion that neither you love them nor they you, not them, for you really feel them very burdensome to you. They love not you, for they must see you are quite weary of them, from whence 'tis a great chance but dislike and enmity will spring up more and more, while kindred and affection fades away. Now could you contrive to make yourself their director and protector in some kind of profitable employment, you would then be fond of them, finding them useful to you, and they would love you, because they would perceive you had pleasure in what they did, and then, reflecting with satisfaction on all former benefits, the obligation to them would be enhanced, and you would grow friendlier and dearer to each other every day. If anything scandalous was proposed to be done, death is rather to be chosen. But now these women know how to perform what is very laudable, very becoming their sex, and whatever we know how to do, that we do with the greatest facility and pleasure. Wherefore make no hesitation to press them to what will be of service to yourself and them, and it is my opinion they will with pleasure agree to the proposal. By all the gods, said Aristarchus, you give me such admirable advice, Socrates, that I, who lately dared not think of borrowing, being sure that when that money was gone, I should never be able to discharge the debt, am now resolved to venture upon it to begin our undertaking. Accordingly, money was raised, a quantity of wool laid in. The women worked, even while they eat their dinner. They worked till supper time. Sorrow was turned into joy. Instead of sour glances, they looked with cheerfulness on each other. They loved him as their guardian, he them as a set of useful relations. Some time after he came again to Socrates, and with pleasure in his face gave him an account of their proceedings, and added, They now accuse me as the only person that eats idle bread in the house. Well, says Socrates, and don't you tell them the fable of the dog? Upon a time when animals could speak, a sheep talked to her master in this manner. We are vastly surprised that to us, who afford you wool and lamb and cheese, you never allow any other food but merely what the earth produces, whereas your dog, by whom you get nothing, comes in for a snap of every sort of victuals you eat yourself. The dog, overhearing this, cries, Ay, but 'tis me you owe your safety, that you are neither stole by the rogues nor devoured by the wolves. Was not I to watch over you, ye durst not go to pasture for your lives. This convinced the sheep of the dog's merit. Tell them, therefore, that you, like the dog, are their guardian and careful overseer, by whose means they live to follow their employments with pleasure and safety. End of section 45.
Section 46 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. The history of Harriot and Sophia concluded. Sophia was not deceived when she imagined she had seen Sir Charles. It was really he who had rode by her window, and it was her little abode he was in search of, though in his extreme eagerness he had overlooked it. He had left England with a hope that change of scene and a variety of new objects would efface the idea of Sophia from his heart and restore him to his former tranquillity. But amidst all the delights of Paris he found himself oppressed with languor. No amusements could entertain him, no conversation engage his attention. Disgusted with everything he saw and heard, peevish, discontented, and weary of the world, he avoided all company, and had recourse to books for relief. But Sophia was too much in his thoughts to render study either instructive or amusing. He passed whole days in solitude, feeding his melancholy with the reflection of 1,000 past circumstances, which served to soften his mind, and make him feel his loss more sensibly. When he reflected on her exalted virtues, her wit, her elegance, the attractive graces of her person, and the irresistible sweetness of her manners, he lamented his hard fate that had put such a treasure out of his reach. But when his conscience told him that it had been once in his power to have become possessor of this treasure, that he had trifled with that innocent affection till he had alienated it from himself to another object, his anguish became insupportable, and he sought to relieve it by rousing his indignation against her for her preference of so unworthy a rival. He called to mind her interview with this happy rival in the field, and concluded he was far more favored by her than himself had ever been, since her discourse to him had produced so tender and passionate an expression of acknowledgment as that he had beheld. These circumstances, which his imagination dwelt upon in order to lessen his regret, added to it all the strings of jealousy, so that, almost frantic with rage and grief, he was 100 times upon the point of committing some desperate action. A violent fever was the consequence of these transports, which, after confining him a long time to his bed, left his body in a weak and languishing condition, and his mind sunk in a habitual melancholy. His physicians recommended to him the air of Montpelier, and he was preparing to set out for that place when he happened to meet with a gentleman who made him alter his resolution. This person had been his governor, and now attended Mr. Howard in the same quality. Sir Charles, who had a slight acquaintance with Mrs. Howard, was prevailed upon, notwithstanding his aversion to company, to receive a visit from her son. He invited the young gentleman to dine with him, and he, having not yet forgot the lovely Sophia, drank her health after dinner by the name of Miss Darnley. Sir Charles, who could not hear that name without a visible emotion, told him he knew 2 young ladies so called, and asked whether it was the eldest or the youngest sister that he meant. Mr. Howard replied that he was ignorant till then that Miss Darnley had a sister. "Yes, she has a sister," said his governor, "who is much handsomer than herself, and for whom a youthful passion would be far more excusable." The young gentleman, who knew his governor, talked in that contemptuous manner of Sophia in compliance with his mother's humor. In revenge, avowed his admiration of her in the most passionate terms, and forgetting that Sir Charles had said he was acquainted with her, described her excellencies with all the enthusiasm of a lover. Sir Charles listened in silence, and when the other had done speaking, told him, with an air of forced gravity, that it was easy to see he was very much in love. This indeed was his real opinion. Nevertheless, he felt no emotions of jealousy or resentment against a rival whom he believed was as unhappy as himself. He asked him with a seeming carelessness if Miss Sophia was not to be married to the son of a rich farmer in the village where she lived, and waited his answer with an agitation of mind which appeared so plainly in the frequent changes of his color that Mr. Howard must have observed it had not the question given him almost as much concern. After a short pause, he replied that he never heard she was going to be married, but, added he, sighing, "I remember I have seen a very handsome young man at Mr. Lawson's who perhaps—" "Aye, aye," interrupted his governor, smiling. "He was the favored lover, no doubt. You have nothing to do but to forget her as soon as you can." The youth sat pensive and silent for some time, then suddenly rising, took leave of Sir Charles and went away. His governor prepared to follow him, but the baronet, anxious to hear more of Sophia, detained him to ask several questions concerning her acquaintance with Mr. Howard. Sir Charles found his old friend had lost no part of his former candor and sincerity. though by the trust reposed in him he was obliged to discountenance as much as possible the passion of his pupil for a young woman so much his inferior in rank and fortune. Yet having seen and conversed with Sophia, he did justice to her extraordinary merit, and acknowledged that Mrs. Howard had treated her harshly. He related to Sir Charles in what manner Mrs. Howard had invited her to her house, and the suspicions she entertained of Sophia's encouraging her son's passion, and designed to ensnare him into a clandestine marriage. Suspicions, added he, which her subsequent behavior entirely destroyed, for the youth was rash enough to avow his passion openly, and solicited her by frequent letters and messages to grant him an interview, which she absolutely refused, and this conduct did her honor and procured her great esteem. Yet it is very likely that her affections are otherwise engaged, and that she has some difficulties to encounter, for she looks thoughtful and melancholy, and affects retirement more than persons of her age generally do. Sir Charles was thrown into so profound a reverie by this account of Sophia, that he heard not a word of what his friend afterwards said which had no relation to this interesting subject, and scarce perceived when he went away. After reflecting a long time with mingled grief, resentment, and compassion upon her melancholy, which he supposed was occasioned by some disappointment in the affair of her marriage with the young farmer, and which probably her want of fortune was the cause of, he suddenly formed the generous design of removing this obstacle to her union with the person whom she preferred to him, and by making her happy, entitle himself to her esteem, since he had unfortunately lost her heart. The novelty of this resolution and its extraordinary generosity filled him with so many self-flattering ideas as suspended for a while his jealousy and his grief. Instead of going to Montpelier, he set out immediately for England, and during his journey was continually applauding himself for the uncommon disinterestedness of his conduct. Nothing is more certain than the motives even of our best actions will not always bear examination. We deceive ourselves first, and our vanity is too much interested in the deception to make us wish to detect it. Sir Charles either did not or would not perceive the latent hope that lurked within his bosom, and which perhaps suggested the designs he had formed. How must such an instance of generous passion, thought he, affect a mind so delicately sensible as Sophia's? She, who had once loved him, and what was more than probable, had not yet entirely forgot him. He never asked himself why his imagination dwelt upon these pleasing images, why he persecuted his journey with such eager haste, as if the purport of it was to receive, not to resign for ever the woman he so passionately loved. When he arrived at his own house, scarce would he allow himself a few minutes' rest after his fatiguing journey. He hastened to Mr. Herbert's lodgings to prevail upon him to justify by his concurrence the designs he had formed in favor of Sophia. Meantime, the secret and powerful impulse by which he was actuated kept his mind in a continual tumult. He hoped, he feared, he wished. He was all anxious expectation, all trembling doubt. He heard with grief that Mr. Herbert was at Bath, for now he knew not how to get access to Sophia, who, being ignorant of his intentions and offended by his behavior, might possibly refuse to see him. He went to the house where Mrs. Darnley lived when he left England. He was surprised to see it shut up. This incident perplexed him more and rendered him more impatient. He returned to his house, ordered his horses to be saddled, and set out immediately for Mr. Lawson's, where he arrived before he had resolved how to introduce himself, or who he should inquire for. However, upon the appearance of a servant at the door, he asked for Mr. Herbert, which Mr. Lawson, hearing, came out himself, and though he did not know Sir Charles, politely requested him to alight, telling him he had just received a letter from Mr. Herbert, which acquainted him that he was perfectly recovered, and that he was on the way to London. Sir Charles accepted Mr. Lawson's invitation, and alighting, following him into a parlour, but in such perturbation of mind that he scarce knew what he did. The good curate, surprised at the pensiveness and silence of his guest, was at a loss what to say to him, or how to entertain him. He gave him an account of Mr. Herbert's illness, which seemed to engage his attention very little, but happening to mention Sophia in the course of his relation, the young baronet started as from a dream, and turned his eyes upon him with a look of eagerness and anxiety, but said not a word. Mr. Lawson paused, as expecting he was going to ask him a question, which Sir Charles, perceiving, said with some confusion, "I beg your pardon, sir, you mentioned Miss Sophia. I have the honour to know her. Pray, how does me do?" "I hope she is well, sir," replied Mr. Lawson. "I have not seen her a long time." "Then she does not board with you now," said Sir Charles, with a countenance as pale as death, dreading to hear something still more fatal. As Mr. Lawson was going to answer him, William, not knowing his father-in-law had company, entered the room abruptly, but seeing the baronet, he bowed, apologized for his intrusion, and instantly retired. The various emotions with which this sudden and unexpected sight of his rival filled the breast of Sir Charles caused such a wildness in his looks that Mr. Lawson, in great astonishment and perplexity, asked him if he was taken ill. Sir Charles, endeavoring to compose himself, replied that he was very well, but in a faltering accent asked who the young gentleman was that had just left the room. Mr. Lawson told him he was his son-in-law. "Your son-in-law?" cried Sir Charles eagerly. "What? Married to your daughter? Is it possible?" Mr. Lawson knew enough of Sophia's story to make him comprehend now who this young gentleman was, who discovered so extraordinary a concern upon this occasion, and charmed to have an opportunity of doing her service by removing those suspicions which he had been told had produced so fatal a reverse in her fortune, he gave the baronet a circumstantial account of his daughter's marriage. Sensible that he was too much interested in this detail to make him think it impertinent, he introduced it no other ways than by declaring himself under the greatest obligation to Miss Sophia, who, having honored his daughter with her friendship, had been the chief instrument of her present happiness. While the good curate related all the circumstances of an affair which had such melancholy consequences, the baronet listened to him with an attention still as the grave. His eyes were fixed upon his with a look of the most eager anxiety, and he scarce suffered himself to breathe for fear of losing any of his words. In proportion as his doubts were removed, his countenance expressed more and more joy, and when, upon his reflecting on all that he had heard, it appeared plainly that the fatal meeting which had caused him so much anguish was the effect of Sophia's solicitude to serve her friend, and that the passionate action of the youth was an acknowledgment of gratitude, not an expression of love, he was not able to conceal the excess of his joy, but rising up in a sudden transport, he took the curate's hand, and pressing it eagerly, "You know not," said he, "Mr. Lawson, how happy you have made me. But where is Miss Sophia? Is she gone to Bath with her good friend Mr. Herbert?" "No, sir," replied Mr. Lawson. "She lives with her mother. You know, I suppose, that Mrs. Darnley has lost her annuity by the death of the gentleman upon whom it was charged." "I never heard it till now," said the baronet, whose tenderness was alarmed for his Sophia. "Tell me, I beg you, what is her present situation?" "Her eldest daughter has left her," said Mr. Lawson, "and she has retired with Miss Sophia to a village about 5 miles from hence, in the road to London, where that excellent young lady supports her mother and herself by the labor of her hands." "Angelic creature!" exclaimed Sir Charles, with his eyes swimming in tears. Then, after a little pause, he desired a direction to the place where Mrs. Darnley lived, and took a kind leave of Mr. Lawson, telling him he hoped soon to visit him again. Sir Charles, although he galloped as fast as was possible, found his horse went too slow for his impatience, so eager was he to see Sophia and gain her pardon for the unreasonable conduct which his jealousy and rage had made him guilty of. The account Mr. Lawson had given him of the part she had taken in his daughter's marriage with the youth whom he had considered as his rival not only removed the torturing pangs of jealousy which he had so long felt, but made him view several circumstances in Sophia's behavior in a light favorable to his own ardent wishes. He fondly fancied that the melancholy in which he had heard she was plunged was occasioned by a tender remembrance of him, and that the hope of still being his might have been the chief cause of her rejecting the addresses of Mr. Howard. How different were these ideas from the gloomy ones which had hitherto perplexed his mind! He seemed like a man waked from a frightful dream of despair and death to a certainty of life and joy. Amidst these transporting reveries he had passed by Sophia's house, without perceiving it to be the same he had been directed to, and when he had reached the end of the village, he looked about for it in vain, and saw no one of whom he could inquire for it but an old woman who was sitting under a tree near the road, making up a nosegay of some flowers such as the late season produced. He stopped his horse and asked her if she knew where Mrs. Darnley lived. At the mention of that name she rose as hastily as her feebleness would permit her, and told him she knew the house very well, and if he pleased would go and show it him. "I am making this nosegay for the sweet young gentlewoman, her daughter," said the old woman. "I carry her flowers every day. Heaven bless her, she is my only support. There is a great many fine folks hereabout, from whom I could never get any relief, but since she came hither I have wanted for nothing. Pray let me show you her house. Old and weak as I am, I would walk 10 miles to do her service." Sir Charles, alighting from his horse, ordered his servant to lead it to the nearest public house, and wait for him there. He told the old woman he would accept of her offer and walk along with her. Then, taking 2 guineas out of his pocket, he gave them to her in reward, he said, for the gratitude she expressed for her young benefactress. The good woman received his bounty with a transport of surprise and joy, and pleasingly repaid him by talking of his beloved Sophia, of whom she related many instances of tenderness and charity towards the poor of the village, and filled him with admiration of that true benevolence which, even in the midst of indignance, could administer to the greater wants of her fellow creatures. When they came within sight of Sophia's little cottage, the old woman, pointing to it, told him Mrs. Darnley and her daughter lived there, upon which the baronet, dismissing her, walked up to it with disordered haste. A row of wooden pails led to a small grass plat before the door. As he approached, he saw Sophia sitting at a window at work. He stopped to gaze upon her. She appeared to him more lovely, more engaging than ever. He wished, yet dreaded her looking up, lest her first thoughts upon seeing him being unfavorable, she should resolve to refuse his visit. He went forwards with a beating heart, and cautiously opening the little gate, reached the door of this humble habitation, unheard and unseen by Sophia. The door flew open at his touch. Poverty has no need of bolts and bars, and every good angel is the guard of innocence and virtue. The noise he made in entering, and the sound of her name, pronounced in a tender accent, made Sophia hastily turn her head. At sight of Sir Charles, she started from her chair, her work fell from her trembling hands. She looked at him in silent astonishment, unable and perhaps unwilling to avoid him. The baronet, whose heart labored with the strongest emotions of tenderness, anxiety, hope, and fear, had not power to utter a word, and while her surprise kept her motionless, threw himself at her feet, and taking one of her hands, pressed it respectfully to his lips, tears at the same time falling from his eyes. Sophia, whose gentle mind was sensibly affected with this action, and the paleness and languor which appeared in his countenance, found it impossible to treat him with that severity which his capricious conduct seemed to demand of her. Nevertheless, she drew away her hand, which he yielded with reluctant submission. "I hoped," said she, in an accent that expressed more softness and grief than anger or disdain, "that I should be spared any farther insults of this sort from you. Those I have already suffered has sufficiently punished me for my weak credulity." Sir Charles, when she began to speak, rose up, but continued gazing on her with the most passionate tenderness, while every word she uttered seemed to pierce his heart. "I will not," pursued Sophia, gathering firmness as she spoke, "ask you why you have intruded upon me thus unexpectedly, or why you assume a behavior so little of a piece with your past actions. I only beg you to believe that I am not again to be deceived, and although I am persuaded my good opinion is of no consequence to you, yet I will tell you that if it is possible to regain it, it will be by never more importuning me with visits which my situation in life makes it very improper for me to admit of." Sophia, when she had said this, went out of the room, without casting a look back upon Sir Charles, who followed her in great disorder, conjuring her only to hear what he had to say. As she was passing to her own chamber, she was met by her mother, who, seeing Sir Charles, was filled with surprise and joy, and perceiving that Sophia was avoiding him, said to her with an angry accent, "Where are you going? What is the meaning of this rudeness?" Sophia, without answering her, retired to her own room, not without great perturbation of mind, for there was something in the baronet's looks and words that seemed to merit a hearing at least, but she dreaded the weakness of her own heart, and was fully persuaded that any condescension on her side would give him too great an advantage over her. Mrs. Darnley, finding her endeavours to retain her were fruitless, advanced towards Sir Charles with great obsequiousness, congratulated him upon his return, and thanked him for the honour he did in visiting her in her poor little habitation. Sir Charles saluted her respectfully and took a seat. "There is a sad alteration, sir," said she, "in my poor affairs since I saw you last. I never thought to have received you in such a hovel. You have heard, I suppose, of my misfortune." Sir Charles, who was in great confusion of thought, and had scarce heard a word she said, replied carelessly, "Yes, madam, I am sorry for it." The coldness of this answer cast a damp upon those hopes which she had eagerly admitted upon seeing him again, and, impatient to be relieved from her tormenting anxiety on account of this unexpected visit, she asked him abruptly whether she might wish him joy, for she heard, she said, that he was going to be married. Sir Charles, roused by this question, replied hastily, "Who could have told you anything so unlikely? Married? No, madam, there never was any foundation for such a report." "Indeed, I believe so," said Mrs. Darnley, almost breathless with joy to find him deny it so earnestly. "To be sure, people are very envious and ill-natured, and those who told me, no doubt, designed to do you an ill office." "And they have succeeded," said Sir Charles, sighing, "if they have been able to persuade Miss Sophia that after having aspired to the possession of her, I could descend to love any other woman. I came to implore her pardon, madam," pursued he, "for all the extravagancies of my past conduct, and for that unreasonable jealousy which was the source of them, could I have been so happy to have prevailed upon her and to have heard me." "What?" interrupted Mrs. Darnley eagerly. "And was my daughter so rude as to leave you without hearing what you had to say? I protest I am ashamed of her behavior, but I hope you will be so good to excuse it, sir. I will insist upon her coming in again." "No, madam," said Sir Charles, holding her, for she was hurrying away. "Miss Sophia must not be constrained. I cannot bear that." Mrs. Darnley unwillingly resumed her seat, and inly fretting at her daughter's obstinacy, trembled for the event of this visit. Sir Charles, after a silence of some minutes, suddenly rose up and took his leave. Mrs. Darnley, in great anxiety, followed him to the door, and said she hoped to see him again. He answered only by a low bow, and walked away full of doubt and perplexity. Sophia's steadiness in refusing to hear him banished all those flattering ideas of her tenderness for him which he had so eagerly admitted, for he concluded that if her heart had not been steeled by indifference, she would, notwithstanding her just reasons for resentment, have been rejoiced to give him an opportunity of justifying himself. He had reached the house where a servant was attending with the horses, without having determined what to do. To return to town without seeing Sophia again, and being assured of a reconciliation, was misery which he could not support, and he dreaded making a new attempt to see her, lest he should receive more proofs of her insensibility and disdain. In this perplexity, the sight of Mr. Herbert alighting from a stagecoach was a relief as great as it was unexpected, and in the sudden joy he felt at meeting with a man whose interposition could be so useful to him, he forgot that his former behavior must necessarily have given rise to strong prejudices against him, and ran up to embrace the good old man with extreme cordiality. Mr. Herbert was surprised, and repaid his civilities with great coldness, upon which the young baronet, in some confusion, desired to have a few moments' conversation with him. They walked together down a meadow, and Sir Charles, having, with a candour and sincerity becoming the rectitude of his intentions, related all those circumstances which had concurred to excite his jealousy, and with that powerful eloquence which passion inspires, expatiated upon the motives of his conduct, a conduct which he acknowledged laid him open to the most unfavourable suspicions. Mr. Herbert, convinced of his sincerity and full of compassion for the torments which his mistaken jealousy had caused him, undertook to make his peace with Sophia, and assured him he would very shortly wait upon him in town. This would not satisfy the anxious lover. He declared he would not leave the place till he was assured of his pardon, and Mr. Herbert, who certainly was not displeased with his obstinacy, could with difficulty persuade him to wait only till the next day for an account of his success. Sir Charles unwillingly took the road to London, and Mr. Herbert hastened to congratulate his beloved charge upon the agreeable prospect that was once more opening for her. Mrs. Darnley had, during this interval, been employed in reproaching poor Sophia for her behavior to Sir Charles. In the vexation of her heart, she exclaimed in the severest terms against her pride and obstinacy. She told her she might be assured Sir Charles would never attempt to see her again, that it was plain he was disgusted with her bad temper. She burst into a passion of tears while she enumerated the glorious advantages of that rank and fortune which, she said, Sophia had thrown from her, and among many motives which she urged ought to have determined her to act otherwise, that of being able to outshine her sister was one. Sophia answered only by sighs. She herself was not absolutely satisfied with the unrelenting severity with which she had treated Sir Charles. The more she reflected upon his behavior, the more she condemned herself for not hearing what he had to offer in his own defense. She had once thought it probable that he had been deceived by the report that was spread through Mrs. Gibbon's folly of her encouraging the addresses of her nephew, and his extravagant conduct might be occasioned by jealousy, a fault which a woman is always disposed to pardon in a lover. While she revolved these thoughts in her mind, Mrs. Darnley perceived her uneasiness, and added to it by new reproaches. Mr. Herbert's arrival put an end to this tormenting scene. Sophia first heard his voice, and flew to receive him. Mrs. Darnley followed, and seeing her bathed in tears, while the good old man saluted her with the tenderness of a parent, She told him with an air half serious, half gay, that her daughter loved him so well she had no tenderness for anyone else. She then entered abruptly upon the affair of Sir Charles, though she hardly expected Mr. Herbert would join with her in condemning Sophia. He pleasingly surprised her by saying that Sophia was to blame, and that he came prepared to chide her for her petulance and obstinacy. Mr. Herbert, who saw a sweet impatience in Sophia's looks, explained himself immediately, and told her he had met Sir Charles, who had fully removed all the suspicions his strange conduct had occasioned, and convinced him that he deserved more pity than censure. "No doubt," pursued he, looking on Sophia with a smile, "you will be surprised to hear, young lady, that Sir Charles was witness to the interview you had in the meadow behind Mr. Larson's house, with a certain handsome youth whom he had heard was his rival, and a favoured rival too. What were his thoughts, do you imagine, when he saw this handsome youth throw himself at your feet and kiss your hand?" Mrs. Darnley now looked at her daughter in great astonishment, and Sophia, who yet did not recollect the circumstance of her meeting William, was so perplexed she did not know what to say. Mr. Herbert enjoyed her innocent confusion for a few moments, and then repeated all that Sir Charles had told him of his jealousy and rage, his vain attempts to banish her from his remembrance, the resolution he had formed after his conversation with Mr. Howard concerning her, and how happily he had been undeceived at Mr. Lawson's, where he found his supposed rival was the husband of her friend. "Well," interrupted Mrs. Darnley with great vehemence, "I hope you are satisfied now, Sophia. I hope you will treat Sir Charles with more civility if he comes again. Mr. Herbert, I beg you will exert your power over her upon this occasion. I think there is no doubt of Sir Charles's honourable intentions." Thus she ran on, while Sophia, who had listened to Mr. Herbert's relation with the softest emotions of pity, tenderness, and joy, continued silent with her eyes fixed upon the ground. Mr. Herbert, willing to spare her delicacy, told Mrs. Darnley that, relying upon Sophia's good sense and prudence, he had ventured to assure Sir Charles of a more favourable reception when her prejudices were removed. "He will come to-morrow, my child," pursued he, "to implore your pardon for all the errors of his past conduct, and to offer you his hand. I am persuaded you will act properly upon this occasion, and in a marriage so far beyond your hopes and expectations, acknowledge the hand of Providence, which thinks fit to reward you, even in this world, for your steady adherence to virtue." Sophia bowed and blushed. Her mother, in a rapture, embraced and wished her joy. Mr. Herbert now endeavoured to change the conversation to subjects more indifferent, but Mrs. Darnley, ever thoughtless and unseasonable, could talk of nothing but Sir Charles and the grandeur which awaited her daughter. All night her fancy ran upon the gilt equipages, rich jewels, magnificent houses, and a train of servants, and she was by much too happy to taste any repose. But Sophia enjoyed the change of her fortune with much more rational delight, and among all the sentiments that arose in her mind upon this occasion, that of gratitude to heaven was the most frequent and most lively. Mr. Herbert, who had accepted a lodging in Sophia's cottage, went to Sir Charles the next day, according to his promise. He found him waiting for him, full of anxious impatience, and hearing from the good old man that Sophia was disposed to receive him favourably, he embraced him in a transport of joy, and his chariot being already ordered, they drove immediately to the village. Mrs. Darnley welcomed the baronet with a profusion of civilities. Sophia's behaviour was full of dignity and soft reserve. Sir Charles, after a long conversation with her, obtained her leave to demand her of her mother, to whom he showed the writings, which were already all drawn, and by which Sophia had a jointure and pin money equal to the settlements that had been made upon Lady Stanley. He now ventured to entreat that a short day might be fixed for their marriage. It was with great difficulty that Sophia was prevailed upon to consent, but her mother's impetuosity carried all before it, and Mr. Herbert himself supported the young baronet's request. The ceremony was performed by Mr. Lawson in his own parish church, after which he and his amiable family accompanied the new wedded pair to their country seat, where they passed several days with them. Mr. Herbert having previously acquainted Sir Charles with Harriot's situation, the baronet, though he detested her character and declared he never could pardon her for the miseries she had caused him, yet was desirous to have her decently settled, and promised to give £1,000 with her in marriage, if a reputable match could be found for her. He even put notes for that sum into Mr. Herbert's hands, and earnestly recommended it to him to take the affair under his management. Harriot, during the time she lived with her mother, had been courted by a young tradesman in tolerable circumstances, and although she thought it great insolence for a person in business to pretend to her, Yet, actuated by a true spirit of coquetry, while she despised the lover, she took pleasure in his addresses. This young man still retained some tenderness for her, and allured by the prospect of a fortune, was willing, notwithstanding any faults in her conduct, to make her his wife. Mrs. Darnley proposed him to her, and Mr. Herbert enforced her to advise with all the good sense he was matter of. But Harriet received the proposal with the utmost disdain, insisted that she was married as well as her sister, that her rank in life was superior to hers, and added by way of threat that her appearance should be so likewise. The extraordinary efforts she made to support this boast engaged Lord L. in expenses that entirely alienated his affections from her, disgusted as he long had been with her insolence and folly. His relations concluded a match for him with a young lady of suitable rank and fortune, and, after making a small settlement on Harriet, he took leave of her forever. The vexation she felt from this incident threw her into a distemper very fatal to beauty. The yellow jaundice made such ravage in her face that scarce any of those charms on which she had valued herself so much remained. All her anxious hours were now employed in repairing her complexion, and in vain endeavors to restore luster to those eyes, sunk in hollowness and tinctured with the hue of her distemper. Although thus altered, the report of the fortune she was likely to have made her be thought a prize worthy the ambition of a young officer, who had quitted the business of a peruke maker, in which he was bred, for an ensign's commission, which made him a gentleman at once. He offered himself to Harriet with that assurance of success which the gaiety of his appearance and his title of captain gave him reason to expect with a lady of her turn of mind. Harriet, charmed with so important a conquest, soon consented to give him her hand, and Sir Charles Stanley, finding his character not exceptionable, gave her the fortune he had promised, to which Sophia generously added £1,000 more. The baronet procured her husband a better commission, but designedly in one of the colonies, whither he insisted upon his wife's accompanying him. Harriet, in despair at being obliged to quit the delights of London, soon began to hate her husband heartily, and he, entering into her disposition and character, lost all esteem and tenderness for her. Her behavior justified the rigid confinement he kept her in, and while she suffered all the restraint of jealousy, she was at the same time mortified with the knowledge that pride and not love was the source of it. Mrs. Darnley lived not long after the departure of her favorite daughter, for so Harriet always continued to be. Sophia attended her mother during her long illness with the most duteous care, and had the satisfaction to be assured by Mr. Lawson, who assisted her in her preparations for death, that her attachment to the world, which the affluent circumstances to which she was raised but too much increased, had at length given way to more pious sentiments, and she died with the resignation of a Christian. The ill conduct of her sister and the death of her mother proved at first some interruption to Sophia's happiness, but these domestic storms blown over, she began to taste the good fortune which Heaven had bestowed on her. Her chief enjoyment of it was to share it with others, and Sir Charles, who adored her, put it amply in her power to indulge the benevolence of her disposition. He took upon himself the care of rewarding her friends. He presented Mr. Lawson a very considerable living. He procured Dolly's husband a genteel and lucrative employment, and married her younger sister to a relation of his own. Mr. Herbert, who was above receiving any other gratification from Sir Charles than the entire friendship which he ever preserved for him, had the satisfaction to spend most of his time with his beloved daughter, as he used tenderly to call Sophia, and to behold her as happy as the condition of mortality admits of. Sir Charles's tenderness for her seemed to increase every day, and when Mr. Herbert once took occasion to compliment him upon the delicacy, the ardor, and the constancy of his affection, he replied with a smile, "You attribute to me a virtue which, in this case, I cannot be said to possess. Had my passion for my Sophia been founded only on the charms of her person, I might probably ere now have become a mere fashionable husband. But her virtue and wit supply her with graces ever varied and ever new. Thus the steadiness of my affection for her is but a constant inconstancy, which attaches me successively to one or other of those shining qualities, of which her charming mind is an inexhaustible source." End of section 46.
Section 47 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, by Charlotte Lennox. The Life of Sir Anthony Van Dyck, concluded. He drew the Marquis Giulio Brignole, a famous poet, on horseback. He drew also the picture of the Marchioness, his wife, in which he seemed to oblige nature itself, for by eternalizing that beauty, he gave an instance to all posterity of what she had been able to perform. He drew the picture of the Doge Pallavicino in his habit of ambassador to the Pope, and George Paulo Balbi on horseback, which was a most exquisite picture, but because of his conspiracy his face was blotted out, being a traitor to his country, and that of Francisco Maria of the same family made in the place. There is also in this person's house, of the hand of Van Dyck, the picture of an old man in white armor. His right hand holds a general's staff, and his left the pommel of his sword, and is in picture as great a soldier as the Marquis Spinola was in effect, and is generally supposed to be intended for him. The Queen of Sweden has in Rome, also of the hand of Van Dyck, the picture of a boy of the family of the Imperiali, which appears so much alive that no body would judge it but to be really so. Besides these pictures of particular persons, he made some histories, amongst which there is a crucifix with St. Francis and our Savior, together with a patron of the picture at prayers. Van Dyck had now a great mind to go into Sicily. Prince Philibert of Savoy being viceroy, he drew his picture, but the plague happening about this time, and the death of the prince, to whom Cardinal Doria succeeded, Van Dyck, likewise, having received some disaster in Palermo, retired in great haste to his home of Genoa, carrying with him the cloth for a picture for the oratory of the Society of the Rosary, in which he represented the Virgin encompassed with the glory of angels that present her each with a crown. At the bottom is St. Dominic, with the 5 virgin saints of Palermo, amongst which are St. Catherine and St. Rosary, and a child that holds his hand to his nose because of the stench that comes from a dead head that lies upon the ground, by which he designs to express the plague from which the city was delivered by the intercession of those saints. This picture being finished and sent to Palermo, he betook himself again to the drawing of faces, by which, having got a good sum of money, he returned to his old town of Antwerp, extolled by all and welcomed by his friends, after the absence of some years. He employed himself here mostly in drawing faces, yet he likewise painted some history pieces, which are dispersed through all Flanders and many other places, of which we shall collect some few, there being already some that are made public by the engraver. Amongst the first of them that was seen at Antwerp was the marriage of St. Joseph in St. Michael's Church, where the saint kneels before the Virgin, while she gives him her right hand, which is proposed to him by an angel. For the nuns of Beguinage, he drew a Pieta, that is, our Savior dead in the lap of his mother, and Magdalene kneeling, kissing the wound of his hand with the St. John. For the Magdalene he drew his sister's face, who was then a nun, to whom he made a present of the picture. He drew also another Pieta for St. Francis's Church, which is as much esteemed as anything he did. He drew our Savior extended on a winding sheet, with his head on his mother's bosom, who, opening her arms, lifts up her eyes to heaven. Behind stands St. John, that takes one of the arms of our Savior and shows the wound to 2 angels who are lamenting at his feet. These 3 last figures are in half shadow, which gives great force to the naked figure of our Savior, upon whom he makes the principal light fall. To the same sister, Susanna Van Dyck, he dedicated the engraven design of another picture in St. Austin's, which is very remarkable for liveliness of color and variety of invention. The saint, being in an ecstasy, is sustained by 2 angels. On one hand of him stands Saint Monica, and on the other a saint of his order, and to St. Austin in this rapture the divinity is revealed from above, one of the angels pointing up to our Savior, whose arms are spread ready to embrace him, and at his feet several little angels with diverse symbols, as one of them holds a scepter with the eye of providence upon it, another a branch of olive, the symbol of peace. A third lifts up a snake with his tail in his mouth, the emblem of eternity. A fourth opposes himself to a flaming sword. A fifth looks the Son of Justice in the face, together with several other mysteries symbolically expressed, and above all a triangle to express the Trinity, with a name written in Hebrew characters. For the sisters of St. Dominic, he painted a crucifix, the saint on one side, and St. Catherine of Siena on the other, and another crucifix in Ghent, with a Magdalene that embraces the cross and St. John. Behind is a man armed on horseback that gives orders to one of the crucifiers to reach the sponge to our Savior, adored and lamented by the angels. In Malines and St. Francis's Church are three other pieces of his hand: our Savior upon the cross over the high altar, and over two other altars, St. Bonaventure saying Mass, and the miracle of St. Anthony of Padua, when the horse kneeled before the host. As for drawing of faces, in which Van Dyck seemed more especially to excel, whilst he continued in Brussels, he drew almost all the nobility in Flanders, having justly acquired greater reputation than any painter since the death of Titian. Indeed, he gave his pictures a certain air and grace in the posture, such perhaps as was admired in Apelles when he had drawn Alexander and Antigonus. He drew the Infanta at length, and Mary of Medici, the Queen Mother, sitting, and the Duke of Orleans, her son, at the time they fled into Flanders. Of his hand are also the pictures of the Cardinal Infant, of Prince Thomas of Savoy in armor on horseback, and many other great personages. In the town-house of the same city he drew after the life the magistrates of that place sitting in judgment, and this is looked upon as one of his best pieces, being composed with great judgment and accurately finished. He drew for the Prince of Orange a story out of Pastor Fido, who bought also of his hand the Virgin with the child Jesus, before whom little angels are dancing. Many other of his pictures, both stories and faces, may be seen at Antwerp and Van Ham's house, as also in that of Diego Verts, who, among the rest, has also those of King Charles I and his queen, drawn at the time Van Dyck presented himself to the court of England. In this abundance of employment and fame, having, as it were, filled all Flanders with his renown, he resolved to make use of the King of England's favor, who then called him for his service to London. In this prince's court, Rubens had already been honorably entertained, the king being always a great lover of all sorts of ingenious arts, and so great a friend and rewarder of foreign ingenuity that in all occurrences he not only countenanced but preferred them. 'Twas so that upon Rubens' departure, Van Dyck succeeded to his favor, which quickly augmented his wealth, and therefore, as it were, necessarily confirmed him in his wonted ostentation of behavior and splendor of equipage. He had, however, opportunity enough of reimbursing his great expenses by frequent visits that were made him by the nobility, who in that followed the example of the king, who went often thither to see him paint, and took delight in his conversation. Van Dyck seemed to vie with the magnificence of Parazin by keeping of servants, coaches, horses, musicians, and buffoons, with which he entertained such persons as came daily to him to be drawn, who were also invited to his table, where he spent no less than 8 or 10 pounds a day. Besides such as are already mentioned, he kept men and women for models to paint by, for his manner was, as soon as the face was done, to finish the rest by the help of these models, placed in this or that posture. The king was pleased many times to be drawn by him, so that Cavalier Bernini at Rome being ordered to make a marble bust of his majesty, he was drawn on one cloth in 3 different views, the one with a whole face, the other 2 in profile and half profile. He drew the king and queen in half length, holding a sprig of myrtle between them, and another of them with the young princes. He drew also the king on horseback, attended by a person that bears his helmet after him. He drew General Goring in a posture of haranguing, and the Lord Newport, master of the ordnance, giving orders to his officers. He drew the Lord Arundel and his lady, who, being a great lover of painting, was the means of Van Dyck's being introduced to the king's favor, and had been a great instrument of his coming into England, which piece he finished to such perfection as if he was resolved to show his art and gratitude together. Of his hand also is that of the Duchess of Buckingham, with her daughters, who in token of the memory of her husband holds his picture in little in her hand. He drew the Duchess of Southampton like the goddess of fortune, sitting upon the globe, and Sir Kenelm Digby, with his wife, sitting in 2 chairs, with their children by them, who being a great virtuoso himself, Van Dyck, as it were by a certain mutual consent of genius, did more especially confide in him. He drew him in several manners, sometimes in his armor, and sometimes in the habit of a philosopher. In one of the latter there is represented a broken sphere, the motto out of Horace, Si fractus illibatur orbis intrepidum ferient ruinae, which picture is one of the 100 that makes up the Book of Famous Men, published by Van Dyck and printed at Antwerp, the best of which are done by himself with aqua fortis, amongst which you find also his own picture. The same Sir Kenelm had a fancy to have his lady drawn in the form of Prudence, sitting in a white robe, with a colored veil and belt of jewels. One hand she reaches to 2 white doves, and the other holds a serpent. She sets her feet upon a cube, to which are chained as slaves Deceit with her 2 faces, Anger, Envy, with snakes about her head, and profane Love, blinded, his wings clipped, his bow broken, his arrows thrown away, and his torch extinguished, with other naked figures according to the life. Above all this is a glory of angels singing and playing upon instruments, 3 of them holding between them a palm and garland over the head of Prudence, in token of victory and triumph over those vices. The motto is taken out of Juvenal, Nullum numen abest sisit prudentia. Van Dyck was so pleased with this invention that he copied it in little, but not finished. Both the one and the other, during the troubles in England, land were carried into France. For Sir Kenelm Digby, he drew also our Savior taken from the cross, with Joseph and Nicodemus, who were anointing him before they laid him in the sepulchre. There is by them Magdalene and the Virgin falling in a swoon, and with this several other pieces of devotion, as St. John Baptist in the wilderness, Magdalene transported, and in an ecstasy at the harmony of the angels, Judith with Holofernes' head in half figure, our Savior upon the cross giving up the ghost, which Sir Kenelm made a present of to the Princess of Guimené when he was at Paris. He drew for him also the picture of a brown woman in the habit of Pallas armed, and a plume in her helmet, a most admirable head. For the Earl of Northumberland he drew our Savior upon the cross, with 5 angels that in golden chalices catch the blood as it falls from the wounds, and under the cross are placed the Virgin, St. John, and Mary Magdalene. He drew also for the king, besides heads in many other pictures, the dance of the Muses, with Apollo in the middle of Parnassus, another Apollo flaying Marsyas, a bacchanal, and a dance of amorettes that are sporting whilst Venus sleeps with Adonis. And there being then in that court, amongst many other virtuosi, Nicholas Lanier, a painter as well as musician, he drew him in the form of David playing upon the harp before Saul. He drew also the Duchess of Richmond, daughter of the Duke of Buckingham, which, by reason of her incomparable beauty, is occasion of a doubt whether art or nature is capable of greater perfection, being drawn in the form of a Venus, which is waited upon by her son Duke Hamilton, naked, in the character of a Cupid, with his bow and arrow. He drew also the Countess of Portland and the Countess of Obangi in the habit of nymphs. He drew also a lady in the character of a Venus, standing by a black. For the Queen he drew the Virgin, with the child Jesus and St. Joseph, that are looking upon certain angels dancing upon the earth, whilst others play to them upon several instruments in the air, and this accompanied with a very pleasant landscape. He drew also, in imitation of Tintoret, the Crucifixion, with the crucifiers that are lifting up the cross, which is a work of great variety of figures. The picture also of the Blessed Virgin is very excellent. She is represented holding up the infant Jesus between 2 angels that play upon instruments. At his foot is the globe of the world, Nor must we pass by the 12 apostles done by his hand, and Christ with a cross, all in half figure, and to be found amongst that great collection of Charles Bosch, Bishop of Ghent, which are made public by the press. He likewise painted a picture of Samson breaking his bonds, which was given by Van Woensel to the Archduke Leopold, governor of the Low Countries, a person that seems to have passed all his time in the study of antiquity, metals, and painting, as we may see by what is already printed of his study. Besides the ordinary rewards of the king's munificence to Van Dyck, his Majesty conferred on him the honor of knighthood, but being now, because of his indispositions, which he had labored under some years, desirous to withdraw himself from the drudgery of portrait painting to some great work, by which his name might be transmitted with honor to posterity, he took a journey to Paris with an intent to procure to himself the painting of the gallery of the Louvre. But after having stayed there 2 months without any success, he returned to England and proposed to the king, by means of Sir Kenelm Digby, to make designs for a suit of hangings for the banqueting house at Whitehall, the subjects of which were to be the ceremony of the crowning of the kings of England, the institution of the Order of the Garter by Edward III, the procession of the knights in their robes, and other functions civil and military. The king was extremely well pleased with this design, but thought his demand of £80,000 too extravagant, though it was believed the price would have been adjusted if Van Dyck's death, which happened at this time, had not put a stop to all farther proceeding. Van Dyck, notwithstanding the vast sums of money he received, left very little at his death, having consumed it all in that splendid manner of living, which was rather like a prince than a painter. As to his person, he was of small stature, but well proportioned and active. His features were regular, and his countenance agreeable. His hair was inclinable to red, which is common to those of his country. It is very extraordinary that his best pictures are those he painted when very young, when he not much exceeded 20 years. He then used, according to the practice of the Venetians, a great body of color, which he afterwards changed for a smoother, insipid, more expeditious manner, using very little color, which, after some time, flying off, left the light parts of the face too white, and the half-shadows too gray. This is the general fault of his portraits of women, and the portraits of the men are very often dry and flat, and in the painter's phrase, starved of color. To balance those faults, which are sometimes found in his work, he possessed other excellencies to the highest degree of perfection: the exact drawing and distinct manner of pronouncing the features, the easy and agreeable attitudes, at the same time marking the peculiar character of the person he drew, has deservedly given him the character of the greatest painter the world has ever yet produced. End of section 47.
Section 48 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Amanda Leung. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2, by Charlotte Lennox. Treatise on the Education of Daughters. Concluded. The Vanity of Beauty and of Dress. There is nothing we ought so much to guard against as vanity in young ladies. They come into the world with a vehement desire to please, finding themselves excluded from those paths by which men arrive at authority and glory. They endeavor to balance that loss by all the captivating qualities of wit and person. This gives rise to their soft and insinuating turn of conversation. Thence it is they so earnestly aspire after beauty and every external grace, and are so warmly interested in dress. The fashion of a cap, the disposition of a ribbon, the form of a curl in this place or that, the choice of a color, are to them matters of importance. This excess is carried to a greater height among us than any other people. The changeableness of our fancy occasions a perpetual revolution of mode, so that to the love of dress, that of novelty is superadded, an article that has strange effects upon such minds. These two follies in confederacy overturn distinction of rank and introduce licentiousness of manners. Void as we are of any regulations in dress or in furniture, there is nothing effectual left with regard to difference of conditions. For as to the tables of particulars, that is what public authority cannot easily give rules to. Everyone proceeds as he can afford, or rather, neglecting that consideration, as his ambition or his vanity prompts him. It is this pride which often ruins whole families, and their ruin draws after it the corruption of manners. On one side, persons of mean birth are stimulated to raise a hasty fortune, a thing not to be compassed without sin, as the Holy Ghost hath assured us. On the other, persons of quality, bereft of all resources, stoop to the basest and most wretched methods of supporting their expense, the consequence of which is that, by insensible degrees, honor and honesty and natural affection become extinguished even among the nearest relatives. Whence is all this evil but from the power which certain vain women have acquired of regulating fashions? Whoever thinks of continuing in the gravity and simplicity of our ancient manners are by these pointed out to be laughed at as so many antiques. Apply yourself, then, to convince young women how much that reputation, which results from a just behavior and true good sense, is more valuable than what can be attained from the pattern of a cap or fancy of a furbelow. Beauty, you may say, deceives the owner still more than it doth its admirers. It disturbs, it intoxicates the soul. The most passionate lover is not more an idolater of his mistress than she is of herself. A small number of years takes away the distinction between a handsome woman and another, and reduces them both to an equality. Beauty is sure to be pernicious unless it is instrumental to an advantageous match. But how can it be so unless supported by merit and by virtue? When, for want of discretion and modesty, she is no object for men of correct understandings and sensible of solid qualities, whom can she hope to attract but some young fool who will make her unhappy? Those who found all their glory upon their beauty in a short time become ridiculous, for, unperceived by themselves, they arrive to that time of life when its luster decays. Yet still are they charming in their own eyes, though the world is so far from being charmed by them that they inspire nothing but disgust. This absolute attachment to beauty alone is just as unreasonable as to place all merit on bodily strength, as do the barbarians and uncivilized nations. True gracefulness hath not the least dependence on a vain and affected mode of dress. Yet it is not amiss to have some regard to propriety, proportion, and suitableness in our apparel, with which we necessarily cover ourselves. But then these materials, which we must put on, and which we may render as commodious as we please, can never, under the name of ornaments, invest us with real beauty. I would take the pains to show young ladies the noble simplicity that appears in the statues and other figures remaining with us of the Greek and Roman women. There they will see that the hair tied negligently in a knot behind, the drapery full and floating in long pleats, are at the same time agreeable and majestic. It would be well if they were to hear the discourse of some painters, or any other person that has entered into the exquisite taste of the ancients. Let their minds be elevated ever so little above the prejudice of fashion, and they will quickly hold in concepts these methods of torturing the hair into unnatural curls, in which there is neither grace nor elegance. I am sensible we are not to propose they should copy the garb of antiquity. That would be an extravagant thing. But they may, without singularity, adopt the taste of simplicity in dress, so noble, so graceful, and so suitable to the decent manners of Christians, so that while they outwardly conform to the present custom, they might at least learn how to think of it. They would fall in with the fashion as a disagreeable obligation, and allow no more to it than they can not well avoid. Teach them early and frequently to observe the vanity, the giddiness, whence the inconstancy of fashion arises. That it is a matter very ill understood appears plainly when we see persons encumber their heads with a load of ornaments. True elegance follows nature and never constrains her. But fashion destroys itself, pretends to aim at perfection, and never hits it. At least it will not stop there. Some reason there would be in changing, in order to change no more, after having once found what is perfectly commodious and genteel, but to go on changing without end. Surely this is to pursue inconstancy and irregularity, not genuine politeness, nor good taste. And so in general mere caprice predominates. 'Tis the woman's prerogative to decide in this matter. Thus the lightest, the shallowest understanding influences all others. They neither take up nor quit anything upon reason. It has been the mode for a considerable time, though never so well invented, that's enough to discard it, and another, though never so ridiculous, shall take its place and be admired by its title to novelty. After having laid this groundwork, we may go farther and show the regulations of Christian modesty, and may say we are taught by our religion that man is conceived in sin, his body afflicted by a contagious illness, proves an inexhaustible source of temptation to his soul. Jesus Christ teaches us to place all our virtue in fear and in distrust of ourselves. Would you be willing, one may ask, to hazard your own soul or your neighbor's for the sake of a foolish vanity? Be terrified, then, at the thought of displaying the uncovered bosom and every other immodesty. Though these faults were committed without design, still they are the result of vanity and an unbridled desire of pleasing. Can this be a justification before God or man for so rash a conduct, so scandalous, so contagious to others? This blind desire of pleasing doth it suit with the mind of a Christian, who ought to regard as a species of idolatry everything that turns us away from the love of the Creator, and, in comparison with him, the contempt of the creatures? Is seeking to please what mean we? Is it not to excite the passions of mankind? And have they so much power over them as shall restrain them from going to excess? Ought we not to impute to ourselves all the consequences? And do they not always run too high if once put in motion? It is you that prepare a subtle and mortal poison, pour it out upon the spectators, and believe yourself innocent. Add to this argument examples of persons whose modesty has been their commendation, and others whose immodesty has drawn upon them the severest censures. Never suffer them to wear what is beyond their rank. Check all their fancies, show them the danger, the contempt they are exposed to from all persons of discretion, when they in this manner forget who they are. Another article remains with regard to girls of a fine genius, which is, to bring them into a right way of thinking. For if we do not take care, they, in their vivacity, are apt to intermeddle, to talk on most things, to give their opinion on subjects disproportioned to their capacity, at other times, to affect a listlessness out of pure delicacy. A young lady should not talk but as occasion requires, and then with an air of doubt and deference. Nay, as to subjects out of the reach of women in general, she should not speak upon them at all, though well informed. For what if her memory be never so good? What if she has vivacity, a pleasant turn of speech, a faculty of conversing with ease and gracefulness? All these qualities will be in common to her and many others of her sex, far from being sensible women, and in themselves despicable. Instead of this, let her endeavor after an exact and steady conduct, a uniform and correct state of mind. Let her learn how to keep counsel and carry on an affair of moment. This quality, so rare to be found, will sufficiently distinguish her. As to delicacy and the affectation of listlessness, these are to be repressed by demonstrating how true good taste consists in accommodating oneself to things according to their utility. Good sense and virtue alone are worthy of estimation, and both these require of us to look upon dislike and listlessness not as a commendable delicacy, but as the infirmary of a sickly mind. Seeing we must converse with gross understandings and have a share in unentertaining businesses, it is the part of reason, which is the only true delicacy, to be as unrefined as those we are to mingle with. A spirit which hath all the taste for politeness, but which knows to rise above it upon a necessity to enter into more solid matters, is infinitely superior to those so delicate ones, and surcharged with their own disgust. In the next place, let us proceed to the consideration of those many articles with which a married woman ought to be acquainted. What are her duties? Upon her lies the education of her children, of the boys to a certain age, of the girls till they be married. The government of her domestics, their morals, their service, the disbursements of housekeeping, the method of living with economy, and at the same time in figure, often even the letting of farms and receiving rents. Women's knowledge, and that of men's also, ought to be limited by their functions, and the difference of them ought to make the difference of their studies. By this rule, then, the subjects above mentioned will be the bounds of female information. But at this rate, A woman of curiosity will be apt to think it put under great restraints. She deceives herself, and all for want of perceiving the importance and extent of the things I propose for her to learn. What degree of penetration is requisite for her to discern the temper, the genius of every particular child? To fall upon a method of conduct towards each that shall best discover their humor, their biases, and their talents? To check the passions on their first disclosure, to instill wholesome maxims, and remedy every error? How much prudence ought she to be mistress of, for gaining and maintaining an ascendancy over them, without risking the loss of friendship and confidence? Nay, is it not absolutely necessary for her to observe and thoroughly know the persons she places about her children? Most certainly. A mother of a family ought to be fully instructed in religion, endowed with an understanding sound, steady, assiduous, and exercised in government. Can anyone doubt of these duties being incumbent on women, seeing they naturally fall to their share even in the lifetime of their husbands, when otherwise employed or absent from home? And to a state of widowhood they are more immediately annexed. Here I omit to enter into all the particulars a woman should be instructed in for the purpose of education, because this hint may serve to give them a notion in general of the extensive knowledge they ought to have. Add to this, family economy. The generality of ladies look upon that as a mean employment, only fit for country people and farmers, or at most for a house steward or woman housekeeper, and these more especially who are bred up in softness, plenty, and idleness, hold every branch of it in the utmost contempt. These conceive very little difference between a life in the country and the life of the savages of Canada. Talk to them of corn, of cultivation, of the nature of estates, or rents, or rights of lordships, of the best way of letting land, or appointing receivers. They will believe you are for having them degrade themselves, and yet this proceeds from pure ignorance. The ancient Greeks and Romans, those adroit and polished people, applied themselves diligently to this science of economy. The noblest among them wrote books, which are still preserved to us, upon their own experience, and descended even to the lowest articles of husbandry. It is a known fact that their victorious generals disdained not to work with their own hands, and from the triumphal car returned to the plough. This is so distant from our manner that it would not be credited did history leave the least room to doubt. Whereas, what more natural reason is there for our defending or enlarging our territories than in order to cultivate them in peace? Of what service is victory but to gather the fruits of peace? After all, true solidity of understanding consists in a willingness to be exactly informed how all those things are managed which are the substantials of human life, for upon these the very greatest affairs are grounded. The power and the felicity of a state consists not in a multitude of provinces ill-cultivated, but in the knowing to raise from its possessions a sufficiency to maintain, without difficulty, a numerous people. To attain a knowledge of every art applicable to economy, to regulate the sum of all the affairs of a family, which may be styled a small republic, requires undoubtedly much higher genius and more extensive than to understand play, or to descant on the fashions, or to exert all the minute gentilities of conversation. It is but a despicable spirit that can do no more than discourse well. Women there are in numbers whose talk abounds with solid maxims, but in whose conduct, for want of early application, nothing but the frivolous is to be found. Nevertheless, we must be on our guard against the opposite fault. Women run a risk of going into extremes. It is good to use them from their childhood to have something under their care, to keep accounts, to know the method of buying and how everything ought to be made, to be useful. Yet, I say, take care lest economy should degenerate into avarice. Be particular in showing the ridiculousness of that passion. Tell them to be cautious, for avarice produces but little profit and much dishonor. A rational mind need carry a frugal and diligent scheme of life no farther than to avoid that shame and injustice which are ever annexed to a prodigal, ruinous conduct. The true end of retrenching superfluous expense is to be in a better capacity to answer all the calls of decency, friendship, and charity. There are occasions when the parting with money is being a greater gainer. Good order is the profitable thing, and not a few petty articles of sordid penuriousness. Wherefore, fail not to paint in strong colors that gross mistake of some ladies, who can please themselves with saving a taper, and let a steward wrong them in the bulk of their affairs. Be no less a friend to neatness and order than to economy and housewifery. Use young ladies not to permit any sluttishness or misplacing of things about the house or furniture, and bring them to observe that nothing contributes more to economy and neatness than everything being in its proper station. As minute as this maxim seems, it will have considerable effects if strictly kept to. Is anything wanted? No time's wasted in looking for it. No trouble, dispute, or disturbance ensues. You take it from its place, make use of it, and replace it again. Order is a principal branch of neatness. Because a proper arrangement affects the eye forcibly, and besides, the place assigned to each being that which is most suitable to it, not only for pleasing the eye, but for the preservation of the thing, it is therefore less liable to decay, less liable to accidental damage, and even shows a propriety in its being there. The same spirit of accuracy which prompts to orderliness prompts also to cleanliness, to which advantage add that such a habit prevents idleness and confusion in our domestics. And more than this, as it makes them ready in the discharge of their duties, so doth it keep us clear of the temptation to impatience at the delays which must happen, when the things we call for can hardly be found. But at the same time avoid running into an excess of elegance and nicety. Nicety in moderation is a virtue, but when we carry our taste to too great a height, it becomes narrowness of mind, for good taste rejects extreme delicacy. It treats little matters as they are and will not be affected by them. Therefore, show, in the children's presence, your derision of those fopperies some women are so fond of, and by which they are so insensibly drawn into useless expenses. Accustom them to a plain and practicable niceness. You may inform them how everything ought to be done, but still further, that they ought to be easy without it. For what a squeamish mind does it betray to grumble if a soup fails of being exactly seasoned, another thing ill pleated, a chair a little too high or too low? Undoubtedly, it is an evidence of a much better understanding to be designedly indifferent, rather than delicate in manners so insignificant. And this faulty delicacy, if not repressed in women of lively parts, has worse effects with regard to their conversation than other subjects. For to them the generality of company will seem so flat and so tiresome, and the least slip in politeness so monstrous, they are always full of scorn and disgust. Let these ladies know betimes that nothing is so injudicious as to judge superficially of a person by his carriage, without sounding the depth of his understanding, his sentiments, or useful qualifications. Demonstrate, by frequent instances, how much a country gentleman, with his coarse manners, or, if you please, ridiculous teasing civility, but with a good heart and steady head, is more worthy of esteem than the most accomplished courtier, who, under that behavior, conceals a heart ungrateful, unjust, and capable of every sort of dissimulation and baseness, and that there is always a weakness adherent to those minds so given to be fatigued and disgusted. No kind of conversation is so poor that some good may not be extracted from it, and though we are in the right to choose the best when we have choice, yet one consolation is left us when distressed, that we may put people upon discoursing of what they know, and then good sense will draw information from the dullest company. End of section 48.
Section 49 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. A poetical epistle from Busy, the lapdog in London, to Snowball, the Buck-hound in Windsor Forest. June 27th, 1760. If we, like men, could envy and malign, at nature's or at fortune's gifts repine, when great be insolent, when little mean, when rich and fat disdain the poor and lean, then might I, puisny Busy, thy vast size contemplate, mighty hound, with grieving eyes; thy strength, thy nose sagacious, snow-white coat, and most the tuneful thunder of thy throat. Then might I, Busy, decked with emerald scorn, the starveling puppy gnawing a stag's horn beneath the hovel red with ash of peat, and think the wretch as odious as his meat. But nor contempt nor envy shook my breast, thee I admired, and empress I caressed. though in her nonage the poor simple whelp kept no decorums, and scarce knew to yelp. Empress may prove the terror of the wood, for Empress, mighty snowballs of thy blood. Say, did I not accept at romps a game with the black young cur? I forget his name. His life in dirt and poverty begun, yet he may rise the favourite of the gun. And I've heard it said, where I have dined, that true distinction amongst humankind lies in the qualities and in the mind. O Snowball, with what pleasure I confess thy condescension to my littleness, when on the floor I dared approach thee near, and gazed on the fine lappet of thine ear. At thy fair temples then my satin hue seemed a black modish patch to distant view. To lick thy chaps, to pinch thy spacious paws, unfeared the range of javelins in thy jaws, or on my hind legs, bolt upright, have tried to reach the curious flavour of thy hide. Thou didst not growl, thou didst not swing a tail, might snap my ribs as ears of corn the flail. Conscious what dignity from goodness springs, and much too great to spurn at tiny things. All homage may your grandeur long receive from lapdogs due, and long unrivalled live, be stroked, be fed by that accomplished hand, whose pen, my master says, adorns the land. O happy Snowball, happy Cranbourne wood, too happy rustics, did ye know your good? Lo, the 10th Muse illuminates your cot. Ah, wretched rustics, ye perceive her not. Eat, Snowball, legs of mutton, while small I crack biscuits, gingerbread, and crust of pie, or lap the remnants of the milky bowl, which none on earth shall ever prove I stole. Joy thou in Windsor's verdant park and air, pursue the chase, and in the daughter share, live in the favour of that learned fair. If my dear mistress smiles and pats my head, if she vouchsafes a corner of her bed, Busy's content, and to her latest gasp will taste the happiness within her grasp. End of section 49. Section 50 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. To ISMENE, playing on a lute. When fair ISMENE to the grove retires, and joins her warbling accents to the lyres, how sweet the enchanting sounds! The melting strains with pleasing raptures fill our swelling veins. The eager ear with ravishment attends the song our soul in ecstasy suspends. Soft we approach, and awful silence keep, a silence more profound than that of sleep. We fear to move, nay, e'en to breathe we fear, lest one soft accent should escape our ear. All things are hushed. The silent trees recline their reverend heads to hear the lays divine. The streams that ceased to purl now creep along, unheard, charmed with the music of her song. The listening birds stoop on the bending wing, and hovering stay to learn of her to sing. Say, ye blessed angels, whose harmonious lays unwearied sing eternal hymns of praise, can heaven itself ISMENE's notes improve, when she's translated to the choirs above? End of section 50.
Section 51 of the Ladies' Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Ladies' Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. Philosophy for the Ladies concluded. Some reflections and deductions drawn from the works of nature in general. As we are now on the point of concluding the present design of this work, it is necessary that we should form some kind of conclusion to that part of it which has had a relation to the works of nature and the study of philosophy. A conclusion, I say, with respect to our confined and narrow limits herein, for such is the immense scope and extent which these subjects would have afforded us, that could the prosecution of our plan have been pursued beyond the period of life allotted to ourselves or our children, Nay, even to the farthest stretch of time, our researches into the wonders of nature's inexhaustible storehouse would have been no other than the pursuance of an apparent horizon, the boundaries of which are ever flying before us, and although they every moment present us with a fresh variety of enchanting objects, yet are, with respect to ourselves, as absolutely distant as the last as at the first moment of our journey. But to proceed. From even the very small portion concerning which we have been enabled to enter into a detail of the numberless amazing properties bestowed on mankind and on the other parts of the animal creation, what is the first, the most natural deduction that must occur to everyone? What, when we perceive that every one of the organs of this grand machine, not only the larger and more apparently useful, but even the more minute, insignificant, and almost invisible ones, are furnished in the amplest manner, not barely with such parts, such limbs, such mechanism, as are needful for their mere existence, but still more particularly with such peculiar contrivances, such sagacity, such intellectual faculties, as must render that existence, with respect to the place, station, and allotment of each individual, absolutely and perfectly happy. Such properties as enabled every one of those beings to preserve that existence, though surrounded by numberless dangers, and to procure the means of supporting it in the midst of apparent scarcity and want. What, when we perceive these assistances bestowed on them with an endless variety, with such a peculiar propriety to every single animal, as if each was of itself the sole and peculiar care of Providence, what, I say, must be the immediate result of these observations, but that the whole must be the work of infinite power, of infinite wisdom, of infinite goodness. Who can cast his eyes around him even with the slightest reflection on what he sees on every side, but must immediately cry out with the royal philosopher, "How manifold are thy works, O Lord! In wisdom hast thou made them all." Can anyone perceive the work of amazing art, and maintain one moment's doubt of the existence of the artist? Must he not indeed be a fool who can say in his heart there is no God? If then this reflection is the first that must arise from this delightful study, and most undoubtedly it is so, can we possibly give scope thereto without proceeding still farther, and finding that due influence produced by it on our minds, which must lead us to the warmest gratitude and the most ardent zeal to do everything that may lead towards the rendering our services acceptable in his sight? Can we look with unconcern on all those wondrous operations? Can we perceive these incomprehensible proofs of infinite perfection in what are but the mechanical exertion, perhaps no more than the sport, if we may be allowed the expression, of his wisdom and power, without conceiving an idea infinitely more exalted of the Almighty Mind? Can we be blind to the proofs that these present us with, of his being equally the origin of all purity and the possessor of all ability? Can we avoid being convinced that he must delight in virtue, and that which he delights in must be happy? How strong an incitement this to the practice of that virtue which, at the same time, delights that being whose minutest pleasure ought to be our supremest joy, and ensures our own happiness in the very act itself. How eminent, then, the advantage to ourselves, and the good to society in general, which might be derived from a proper application of this study, and from how evident a parity of reasoning will every thinking man be convinced, whilst he sees every part of creation in general formed with such a connection, such a necessary dependence on every other part, as well as on the great whole, how strongly, I say, will he be convinced of the duty incumbent on himself to promote as much as possible in this grand design, and render his every action conducive to it in the peculiar circle which Heaven has assigned to him to fill? In how smooth, how tranquil a path might all the transactions of this world proceed, would every man but carry the reflection from natural to moral connections, and persuaded that his own happiness must proportionably depend on that of every individual around him, labor to accelerate the movement of these admirably contrived wheels, instead of clogging them with the intricate machinery of self-interest, or dragging them back with the weight of vice and folly. But now let us consider nature's work in a second point of view. Let us consider man and every other animated part of the creation as a separate and detached being, and placed in his peculiar sphere without connection or relationship with any other. Even in this light, how admirable, how incomprehensible is the extent of omnipotent care in this formation of each. How amazingly is each animal provided by the all-wise fountain of good with every means for his preservation. How admirably are dangers and necessities spread around him, as if they were designed to shew the unlimited wisdom of the Creator in the variety of means pointed out to him for avoiding the one and reliving the other, at the same time that both are rendered the instruments of his happiness, from that consciousness of relief which heightens the enjoyment of every blessing by a sensibility of the misery attached to its opposite situation. In this view, how much has man in particular to felicitate himself upon? How many grateful reflections ought his mind to overflow with when he considers his situation as more exposed, more helpless in its original and apparent state than that of any other animal, yet in the course of life, in the period of his existence, more thoroughly protected, more perfectly supplied with conveniences than that of his fellow creatures would be, even if the various resources of them all could be united for the service of each individual. With what an eye of admiration ought he to look up to the being who, by a peculiar distinction, has so highly and almost partially favored him, as to bestow on him alone that single spark from heaven, that emanation from himself which in itself answers every purpose that anything beneath immortality ought to wish for the power of executing. Again, let us permit this last reflection to produce another very proper effect on our minds, and at the same time that it inspires us with a most exalted degree of acknowledgment to the just giver of all things, suffer it to strike us with a conscious humility, and curb that indecent, that dangerous pride which frequently puffs up the mind of man, and is the occasion that, conceiving himself to the Lord of the universe, being placed so high, he stains subjection and thinks one step higher would set him highest. But let this Lord of nature, the sovereign of the universe, call his eyes around and see all other beings emerged into life almost in a state of perfection. Let him look on the poor servile dog and the domestic kitten within 2 months of their appearance in the world, able to quit the tender parent's care, and seek their prey, endowed with all the faculties to find and to destroy it. Let him observe the little duckling bursting from the egg and rushing instantly into an unruly, a destructive element to pick up food and taste the joys of living. Let him go farther still, and mark the light, the tender, the seemingly insignificant ephemeron, with a life destined but for some hours' continuance, burst from its embryo state in one element, and almost imperceptibly become the inhabitant of another, and able to rove unlimited and taste of every pleasure his being will admit of. After even this slight review, let him but turn his eyes back on his own infant state, and see himself mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, unable for a time to find a use even for his very limbs, for a yet longer period of time deprived of the advantages of language, and still much longer under the necessity of aid, and of instruction to form his reasoning faculties, and render him capable of self-assistance. Again, when brought to his maturity and fullness of perfection as to his natural state, how still deficient in every particular both of attack, defense, and sustenance. First, for attack, the lion has his teeth, the bull his horns, the eagle his talons, and the hawk his beak, either to combat with their foes or to destroy their prey. But what has man? None of all these. Consider him unassisted, he could not stab the sheep, knock down the ox, or combat with the hog, did either know his weakness or their own power to resist him. With what propriety, then, do we pray to the bestower and disposer of all life to give us our daily bread? Next, for defense, the horse has his heels, the fox his holes, the calamari can spread a cloud of ink around him, and the torpedo strike with numbness and insensibility the creature which shall dare to touch him. The cat can swell her form to twice its size, and even a little bird distort her figure into such shapes of terror as shall deter even animals of bulk and power from coming near her nest. But which of these advantages does man possess? His speed the heavy elephant will overtake. He cannot dig into the earth to hide him from his foe, nor with his firmest frown or fiercest attitude drive back the hungry wolf or half-starved tiger. Then for his sustenance the crocodile can change his form, and the chameleon his color, the spider spread a web, and the polypus expand a net, to allure and to entrap their prey. But man, unaided by the means of art and of 1,000 substances not any way appertaining to himself, might starve in the midst of plenty, and daily suffer the fabled fate of Tantalus, to see perpetually before him the greatest delicacies without being able to procure or to enjoy them. What deductions, then, may be drawn from these observations? Evidently the two following with which we shall terminate this discourse, viz., first, that whatever we may imagine of ourselves and of our self-applied superiority, it must, if it has existence at all, be owing to the favor of that omnipotent being, who was equally the creator of all other creatures as of ourselves, and that therefore, instead of harboring an unbecoming pride on the possession of the peculiar gift of reason, which supplies in one single property all the deficiencies I have been just mentioning, we ought assuredly to be inspired with the utmost humility, united to gratitude, when we consider ourselves as selected out to enjoy that blessing from amidst such an infinite variety of his other works, every one of which appears to have an equal, and many of them even a higher claim to that most desirable preference. And secondly, that since in nature advantages may even of the lowest and most insignificant beings seem greatly to excel us, there certainly must be some other part of us, some more intellectual and immaterial part belonging to us, in which our superiority must necessarily consist, to which therefore we ought to pay a more particular attention, and on the cultivation and improvement of which must wholly depend every essential view of happiness, both in our present state and that which is to come. End of section 51.
Section 52 of the Ladies Museum, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Prajakta. The Ladies Museum, Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox. The Ladies' Geography. Description of the island of Ceylon concluded. There are in this island a very particular kind of blackish leeches which lurk under the grass and are extremely troublesome to foot travelers. They are at first not thicker than a horsehair, but grow to be of the bulk of a goose quill and 2 or 3 inches in length. They are only to be seen in the rainy seasons, at which times crawling up the legs of those who walk barefoot, as is the custom of that country. They sting them and suck their blood with so much quickness that it is impossible to get rid of them before they have effected their purpose. This might seem incredible were it not for the prodigious multitudes in which they make their attacks, which consequently renders a considerable time necessary to oblige them to quit their hold. As the island is very full of woods and lakes, it is natural to imagine that it must also be very amply stored with birds and fishes. Among the former are great plenty of green parakeets, but of a kind that cannot be taught to speak. They have 2 other sorts of birds, however, which learn very easily. They are about the size of a blackbird and are called by the natives by the names of mar cauda and cow cauda. The first is black and the other of a bright gold color. As to fish, their lakes and rivers are extremely full of them, particularly of salmon, but the inhabitants seem to set no great value on them. Serpents of many kinds, both venomous and inoffensive, are found in this island, amongst which the most remarkable are, first, the pimbera, which is as thick as a man's body, feeds mostly on deer and other animals of a like kind, and it is said will swallow a kid whole, whose horns will sometimes pierce through his belly and kill him. Second, the polonga, which is about 5 or 6 feet long and extremely venomous. And third, the noya, which is a greyish snake, not above 4 feet long, and is marked on its head with the appearance of a pair of spectacles. He is a mortal enemy to the polonga, and whenever they meet, the battle constantly terminates in the death of one or the other of them. He is, however, very harmless, on which account the Indians call him Noya Rottgera or the royal snake. There is a kind of venomous lizard on this country which they name Heinkenella and which harbors in the eaves and thatchings of houses, but will not attack a man unless provoked. But the most formidable creature belonging to this island is a prodigious large black hairy spider, which they call Democulo. Its body is as large as one's fist, and its legs proportionable. Nothing can be more mocking than its bite, which is not immediately mortal, but affects the senses and occasions madness. As to the mane, They find assistance in this case from certain herbs and barks when applied to in time, but the cattle are frequently bit or stung by these monstrous creatures and die without any remedy having been yet discovered to preserve them. As to the mineral kingdom, this country produces many kinds of gems and in great quantity, particularly sapphires, rubies, and cat's eyes. But these are all secured for the king's use. They have besides both iron and lead mines, but these, as well as many other valuable productions of the island, are considered of little worth compared to the cinnamon and wild honey, which are, properly speaking, the peculiar traffic of the country, and of which the Dutch have made an amazing advantage since their conquest of it. Having thus got through the description of the island of Ceylon and mentioned the most extraordinary particulars of curiosity in it, we shall now take leave of our readers, recommending to their perusal the farther accounts given by the travellers who have visited it, and who seem all to unite in opinion as to its being one of the finest, most amply stored, and most amazingly diversified spot throughout the whole extent of the East Indies. Finish. End of section 52. End of The Ladies' Museum Volume 2 by Charlotte Lennox.